Blackstone Audio presents Intellectuals and Society by Thomas Sowell. Preface. There has probably never been an era in history when intellectuals have played a larger role in society. When those who generate ideas, the intellectuals proper, are surrounded by a wide penumbra of those who disseminate those ideas, whether as journalists, teachers, staffers to legislators, or clerks to judges, and other members of the intelligentsia, their influence on the course of social evolution can be considerable, or even crucial. That influence has of course depended on the surrounding circumstances, including how free intellectuals have been to propagate their own ideas, rather than being instruments of state propaganda, as in totalitarian countries. There would of course be little point in studying the ideas expressed by prominent writers like Ilya Ehrenberg during the era of the Soviet Union, for these were simply the ideas permitted or advocated by the Soviet dictatorship. In short, the study of the influence of intellectuals is here a study of their influence where they have been freest to exert that influence, namely in modern democratic nations. For very different reasons, this study of patterns among intellectuals will pay less attention to such an intellectual giant as Milton Friedman as to any number of intellectuals of lesser eminence, simply because Professor Friedman was in many ways very atypical of the intellectuals of his time, both in his scholarly work that won him a Nobel Prize and in his work as a popular commentator on issues of the day. A balanced general intellectual history of our times would have to give Professor Friedman a far larger amount of attention than a study which focuses on general patterns to which he was an outstanding exception. Alexander Solzhenitsyn was another landmark figure in the intellectual, moral, and political history of his age, who was likewise too atypical of contemporary intellectuals to be included in a study of the general patterns of the profession. Many books have been written about intellectuals. Some take in-depth looks at particular prominent figures, Paul Johnson's Intellectuals being an especially incisive example. Other books on intellectuals focus on the ideas of particular eras. Richard A. Posner's Public Intellectuals is about those intellectuals who directly address the public, while the focus in Intellectuals and Society is about intellectuals who influence, sometimes shape, public attitudes and beliefs, whether or not they are widely read by the population at large. As J. A. Schumpeter said, "There are many Keynesians and Marxians who have never read a line of Keynes or Marx. They have gotten their ideas second or third hand from the intelligentsia." Among the many things said by those who have studied intellectuals, a comment by Professor Mark Lilla of Columbia University in his book The Reckless Mind is especially striking. Distinguished professors, gifted poets, and influential journalists summoned their talents to convince all who would listen that modern tyrants were liberators, and that their unconscionable crimes were noble when seen in the proper perspective. Whoever takes it upon himself to write an honest intellectual history of 20th century Europe will need a strong stomach, but he will need something more. He will need to overcome his disgust long enough to ponder the roots of this strange and puzzling phenomenon. While Intellectuals and Society is not an intellectual history of 20th century Europe, that would be a much larger project for someone much younger. It does attempt to unravel some of the puzzling phenomena in the world of the intellectuals, as that world impacts society at large. Rather than simply generalizing from the writings or behavior of particular intellectuals, this book will analyze both the vision and the incentives and constraints behind the general patterns found among contemporary members of the intelligentsia, as well as what they have said and its impact on the societies in which they said it. Although we already know much about the biographies or ideologies of particular prominent intellectuals, systematic analyses of the nature and role of intellectuals as a group in society are much less common. This book seeks to develop such an analysis and to explore its implications for the direction in which the intelligentsia are taking our society and Western civilization in general. Although this book is about intellectuals, it is not written for intellectuals. Its purpose is to achieve an understanding of an important social phenomenon and to share that understanding with those who wish to share it, in whatever walk of life they might be. Those among the intelligentsia who are looking for points to score or things at which to take umbrage will be left to their own devices. This book is written for those readers who are willing to join with me in a search for some understanding of a distinct segment of the population whose activities can have and have had momentous implications for nations and civilizations. Thomas Sowell, Hoover Institution, Stanford University. Chapter 1. Intellect and Intellectuals. Intelligence is quickness to apprehend, as distinct from ability, which is capacity to act wisely on the thing apprehended. Alfred North Whitehead. Intellect is not wisdom. There can be unwise intellect, as Thomas Carlyle characterized the thinking of Harriet Taylor, the friend and later wife of John Stuart Mill. Sheer brain power, intellect, the capacity to grasp and manipulate complex concepts and ideas, can be put at the service of concepts and ideas that lead to mistaken conclusions and unwise actions in light of all the factors involved, including factors left out of some of the ingenious constructions of the intellect. Karl Marx's Kapital was a classic example of an intellectually masterful elaboration of a fundamental misconception, in this case, the notion that labor, the physical handling of the materials and instruments of production, is the real source of wealth. Obviously, if this were true, countries with much labor and little technology or entrepreneurship would be more prosperous than countries with the reverse, when in fact it is blatantly obvious that the direct opposite is the case. Similarly, with John Rawls' elaborate and intricate A Theory of Justice, in which justice becomes categorically more important than any other social consideration. But obviously, if any two things have any value at all, one cannot be categorically more valuable than the other. A diamond may be worth much more than a penny, but enough pennies will be worth more than any diamond. Intelligence versus intellect. The capacity to grasp and manipulate complex ideas is enough to define intellect, but not enough to encompass intelligence, which involves combining intellect with judgment and care in selecting relevant explanatory factors and in establishing empirical tests of any theory that emerges. Intelligence minus judgment equals intellect. Wisdom is the rarest quality of all, the ability to combine intellect, knowledge, experience, and judgment in a way to produce a coherent understanding. Wisdom is the fulfillment of the ancient admonition, "With all your getting, get understanding." Wisdom requires self-discipline and an understanding of the realities of the world, including the limitations of one's own experience and of reason itself. The opposite of intellect is dullness or slowness, but the opposite of wisdom is foolishness, which is far more dangerous. George Orwell said that some ideas are so foolish that only an intellectual could believe them, for no ordinary man could be such a fool. The record of 20th century intellectuals was especially appalling in this regard. Scarcely a mass-murdering dictator of the 20th century was without his intellectual supporters, not simply in his own country, but also in foreign democracies, where people were free to say whatever they wished. Lenin, Stalin, Mao, and Hitler all had their admirers, defenders, and apologists among the intelligentsia in Western democratic nations, despite the fact that these dictators each ended up killing people of their own country on a scale unprecedented even by despotic regimes that preceded them. Defining intellectuals. We must be clear about what we mean by intellectuals. Here, intellectuals refers to an occupational category, people whose occupations deal primarily with ideas, writers, academics, and the like. Most of us do not think of brain surgeons or engineers as intellectuals, despite the demanding mental training that each goes through, and virtually no one regards even the most brilliant and successful financial wizard as an intellectual. At the core of the notion of an intellectual is the dealer in ideas as such, not the personal application of ideas, as engineers apply complex scientific principles to create physical structures or mechanisms. A policy wonk, whose work might be analogized as social engineering, will seldom personally administer the schemes that he or she creates or advocates. That is left to bureaucrats, politicians, social workers, the police, or whoever else might be directly in charge of carrying out the ideas of the policy wonk. Such labels as applied social science may be put on the policy wonk's work, but that work is essentially the application of general ideas only to produce more specific ideas about social policies, to be turned into action by others. The policy wonk's work is not personally carrying out those specific ideas, as a physician applies medical science to particular flesh-and-blood human beings, or as an engineer stands in hip boots on a construction site where a building or a bridge is being built. The output, the end product, of an intellectual consists of ideas. Jonas Salk's end product was a vaccine, as Bill Gates' end product was a computer operating system. Despite the brainpower, insights, and talents involved in these and other achievements, such individuals are not intellectuals. An intellectual's work begins and ends with ideas, however influential those ideas may be on concrete things in the hands of others. Adam Smith never ran a business, and Karl Marx never administered a gulag. They were intellectuals. Ideas, as such, are not only the key to the intellectual's function, but are also the criteria of intellectual achievements and the source of the often dangerous seductions of the occupation. The quintessential intellectuals of the academic world, for example, are those in fields which are more pervaded by ideas as such. A university's business school, engineering school, medical school, or athletics department is not what usually comes to mind when we think of academic intellectuals. Moreover, the prevailing ideologies and attitudes among academic intellectuals are usually least prevalent in these particular parts of an academic campus. That is, sociology departments have generally been found to be more one-sidedly to the left politically compared to medical schools, psychology departments more to the left than engineering schools, English departments to the left of economics departments, and so on. The term pseudo-intellectual has sometimes been applied to the less intelligent or less knowledgeable members of this profession. But just as a bad cop is still a cop, no matter how much we may regret it, so a shallow, confused, or dishonest intellectual is just as much a member of that occupation as a paragon of the profession. Once we are clear as to whom we are talking about when we speak of intellectuals, that it is an occupational description rather than a qualitative label or an honorific title, then we can look at the characteristics of such occupations and the incentives and constraints faced by the people in those occupations in order to see how those characteristics relate to how such people behave. The larger question, of course, is how their behavior affects the society in which they live. The impact of an intellectual, or of intellectuals in general, does not depend on their being so-called public intellectuals who directly address the population at large, as distinct from those intellectuals whose ideas are largely confined to others in their respective specialties or to other intellectuals in general. Books with some of the biggest impacts on the 20th century were written by Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud in the 19th century, and seldom read, much less understood, by the general public. But the conclusions, as distinguished from the intricacies of the analyses, of these writers inspired vast numbers of intellectuals around the world, and, through them, the general public. The high repute of these writings added weight and provided confidence to many followers who had not personally mastered these writings, or perhaps had not even tried to. Even intellectuals whose very names have been little known to the general public have had worldwide impacts. Friedrich Hayek, whose writings, notably The Road to Serfdom, began an intellectual counter-revolution, later joined by Milton Friedman, reaching a political climax with the rise of Margaret Thatcher in Britain and Ronald Reagan in the United States, was little known or read, even in most intellectual circles. But he inspired many public intellectuals and political activists around the world, who in turn made his ideas the subject of wider discourse and an influence on the making of government policies. Hayek was a classic example of the kind of intellectual described by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes as a thinker who, 100 years after he is dead and forgotten, men who have never heard of him will be moving to the measure of his thought. The intelligentsia. Around a more or less solid core of producers of ideas, there is a penumbra of those whose role is the use and dissemination of those ideas. These latter individuals would include those teachers, journalists, social activists, political aides, judges, clerks, and others who base their beliefs or actions on the ideas of intellectuals. Journalists in their roles as editorial writers or columnists are both consumers of the ideas of intellectuals and producers of ideas of their own, and so may be considered intellectuals in such roles, since originality is not essential to the definition of an intellectual, so long as the end product is ideas. But journalists in their roles as reporters are supposed to be reporting facts, and insofar as these facts are filtered and slanted in accordance with the prevailing notions among intellectuals, these reporters are part of the penumbra surrounding intellectuals. They are part of the intelligentsia, which includes but is not limited to the intellectuals. Finally, there are those whose occupations are not much impacted by the ideas of the intellectuals, but who are nevertheless interested as individuals in remaining au courant with those ideas, if only for discussion on social occasions, and who would feel flattered to be considered part of the intelligentsia. Ideas and accountability. Because of the enormous impact that intellectuals can have, both when they are well known and when they are unknown, it is critical to try to understand the patterns of their behavior and the incentives and constraints affecting those patterns. Ideas are, of course, not the exclusive property of intellectuals, nor is the complexity, difficulty, or qualitative level of ideas the crucial factor in determining whether those who produce these ideas are or are not considered to be intellectuals. Engineers and financiers deal with ideas at least as complex as those of sociologists or professors of English, yet it is these latter who are more likely to come to mind when intellectuals are discussed. Moreover, it is the latter who most exhibit the attitudes, beliefs, and behavior associated with intellectuals. Verifiability. The standards by which engineers and financiers are judged are external standards, beyond the realm of ideas and beyond the control of their peers. An engineer whose bridges or buildings collapse is ruined, as is a financier who goes broke. However plausible or admirable their ideas might have seemed initially to their fellow engineers or fellow financiers, the proof of the pudding is ultimately in the eating. Their failure may well be registered in their declining esteem in their respective professions, but that is an effect, not a cause. Conversely, ideas which might have seemed unpromising to their fellow engineers or fellow financiers can come to be accepted among those peers if the empirical success of the ideas becomes manifest. The same is true of scientists and athletic coaches. But the ultimate test of a deconstructionist's ideas is whether other deconstructionists find those ideas interesting, original, persuasive, elegant, or ingenious. There is no external test. In short, among people in mentally demanding occupations, the fault line between those most likely to be considered intellectuals and those who are not tends to run between those whose ideas are ultimately subject to internal criteria and those whose ideas are ultimately subject to external criteria. The very terms of admiration or dismissal among intellectuals reflect the non-empirical criteria involved. Ideas that are complex, exciting, innovative, nuanced, or progressive are admired, while other ideas are dismissed as simplistic, outmoded, or reactionary. But no one judged Vince Lombardi's ideas about how to play football by their plausibility a priori, or by whether they were more complex or less complex than the ideas of other football coaches, or by whether they represented new or old conceptions of how the game should be played. Vince Lombardi was judged by what happened when his ideas were put to the test on the football field. Similarly, in the very different field of physics, Einstein's theory of relativity did not win acceptance on the basis of its plausibility, elegance, complexity, or novelty. Not only were other physicists initially skeptical, Einstein himself urged that his theories not be accepted until they could be verified empirically. The crucial test came when scientists around the world observed an eclipse of the sun and discovered that light behaved as Einstein's theory said it would behave, however implausible that might have seemed beforehand. The great problem, and the great social danger, with purely internal criteria is that they can easily become sealed off from feedback from the external world of reality and remain circular in their methods of validation. What new idea will seem plausible depends on what one already believes. When the only external validation for the individual is what other individuals believe, everything depends on who those other individuals are. If they are simply people who are like-minded in general, then the consensus of the group about a particular new idea depends on what that group already believes in general, and says nothing about the empirical validity of that idea in the external world. Ideas sealed off from the outside world in terms of their origin or their validation may nevertheless have great impact on that external world in which millions of human beings live their lives. The ideas of Lenin, Hitler, and Mao had enormous and often lethal impact on those millions of people, however little validity those ideas had in themselves or in the eyes of others beyond the circles of like-minded followers and subordinate power wielders. The impact of ideas on the real world can hardly be disputed. The converse, however, is not nearly as clear, despite fashionable notions that major changes in ideas are generated by great events. As the late Nobel Prize-winning economist George J. Stigler pointed out, a war may ravage a continent or destroy a generation without posing new theoretical questions. Wars have all too often done both these things in the course of many centuries, so this hardly presents a new phenomenon for which some new explanation is required. While one might regard Keynesian economics, for example, as a system of ideas particularly relevant to the events of the era in which it was published, namely the Great Depression of the 1930s, what is remarkable is how seldom that can be said of other landmark intellectual systems. Were falling objects more common or more fraught with social impact when Newton's laws of gravity were developed? Were new species appearing or old ones disappearing more often or more consequentially when Darwin's Origin of Species was written? What produced Einstein's theory of relativity, other than Einstein's own thinking? Accountability. Intellectuals, in the restricted sense which largely conforms to general usage, are ultimately unaccountable to the external world. The prevalence and presumed desirability of this are confirmed by such things as academic tenure and expansive concepts of academic freedom and academic self-governance. In the media, expansive notions of freedom of speech and of the press play similar roles. In short, unaccountability to the external world is not simply a happenstance, but a principle. John Stuart Mill argued that intellectuals should be free even from social standards, while setting social standards for others. Not only have intellectuals been insulated from material consequences, they have often enjoyed immunity from even a loss of reputation after having been demonstrably wrong. As Eric Hoffer put it, one of the surprising privileges of intellectuals is that they are free to be scandalously asinine without harming their reputation. The intellectuals who idolized Stalin while he was purging millions and stifling the least stirring of freedom have not been discredited. They are still holding forth on every topic under the sun and are listened to with deference. Sartre returned in 1939 from Germany, where he studied philosophy, and told the world that there was little to choose between Hitler's Germany and France. Yet Sartre went on to become an intellectual pope, revered by the educated in every land. Sartre was not unique. Environmentalist Paul Ehrlich said in 1968, "The battle to feed all of humanity is over. In the 1970s, the world will undergo famines. Hundreds of millions of people are going to starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now." Yet after that decade, and later decades, had come and gone, not only had nothing of the sort happened, a growing problem in a growing number of countries was obesity and unsaleable agricultural surpluses. But Professor Ehrlich continued to receive not only popular acclaim, but also honors and grants from prestigious academic institutions. Similarly, Ralph Nader first became a major public figure with the 1965 publication of his book, Unsafe at Any Speed, which depicted American cars in general, and the Corvair in particular, as accident-prone. Yet despite the fact that empirical studies showed the Corvair to be at least as safe as other cars of its day, Nader not only continued to have credibility, but acquired a reputation for idealism and insight that made him something of a secular saint. Innumerable other wrong predictions, about everything from the price of gasoline to the outcome of Cold War policies, have left innumerable other false prophets with just as much honor as if they had been truly prophetic. In short, constraints which apply to people in most other fields do not apply even approximately equally to intellectuals. It would be surprising if this did not lead to different behavior. Among those differences are the ways they see the world, and the way they see themselves in relation to their fellow human beings and the societies in which they live. Chapter 2. Knowledge and Notions. From an early age, smart people are reminded of their intelligence, separated from their peers in gifted classes, and presented with opportunities unavailable to others. For these and other reasons, intellectuals tend to have an inflated sense of their own wisdom. Daniel J. Flynn. Like everyone else, intellectuals have a mixture of knowledge and notions. For some intellectuals in some fields, that knowledge includes knowledge of the systematic procedures available to test notions and determine their validity as knowledge. Since ideas are their life's work, intellectuals might be expected to more thoroughly or more systematically subject notions to such tests. Whether or to what extent they do so in practice is, of course, itself a notion that needs to be tested. There are, after all, other skills in which intellectuals also tend to excel, including verbal skills that can be used to evade the testing of their favorite notions. In short, the various skills of intellectuals can be used either to foster intellectual standards or to circumvent those standards and promote non-intellectual or even anti-intellectual agendas. In other words, intellectuals, defined as an occupational category, may or may not exemplify the intellectual process. Indeed, it is possible for people not defined as intellectuals, engineers, financiers, physicians, to adhere to intellectual procedures more often or more rigorously than some or most intellectuals. The extent to which this is true is another empirical question. What is important here is that the mere word intellectual, applied to an occupational category, not be allowed to insinuate the presence of intellectual principles or standards, which may or may not, in fact, be present. However important rigorous intellectual principles may be within particular fields in which some intellectuals specialize, when people operate as public intellectuals, espousing ideas and policies to a wider population beyond their professional colleagues, they may or may not carry over intellectual rigor into these more general, more policy-oriented, or more ideologically charged discussions. Bertrand Russell, for example, was both a public intellectual and a leading authority within a rigorous field. But the Bertrand Russell who is relevant here is not the author of landmark treatises on mathematics, but the Bertrand Russell who advocated unilateral disarmament for Britain in the 1930s while Hitler was rearming Germany. Russell's advocacy of disarmament extended all the way to disbanding the Army and Navy and Air Force, again with Hitler rearming not far away. The Noam Chomsky who is relevant here is not the linguistics scholar, but the Noam Chomsky of similarly extravagant political pronouncements. The Edmund Wilson who is relevant is not the highly regarded literary critic, but the Edmund Wilson who urged Americans to vote for the Communists in the 1932 elections. In this, he was joined by such other intellectual luminaries of the time as John Dos Passos, Sherwood Anderson, Langston Hughes, Lincoln Steffens, and many other well-known writers of that era. Visiting the United States in 1933, George Bernard Shaw said, "You Americans are so fearful of dictators. Dictatorship is the only way in which government can accomplish anything. See what a mess democracy has led to. Why are you afraid of dictatorship?" Leaving London for a vacation in South Africa in 1935, Shaw declared, "It is nice to go for a holiday and know that Hitler has settled everything so well in Europe." While Hitler's anti-Jewish actions eventually alienated Shaw, the famous playwright remained partial to the Soviet dictatorship. In 1939, after the Nazi-Soviet pact, Shaw said, "Herr Hitler is under the powerful thumb of Stalin, whose interest in peace is overwhelming, and everyone except myself is frightened out of his or her wits." A week later, the Second World War began, with Hitler invading Poland from the west, followed by Stalin invading from the east. The list of top-ranked intellectuals who made utterly irresponsible statements, and who advocated hopelessly unrealistic and recklessly dangerous things, could be extended almost indefinitely. Many public intellectuals have been justly renowned within their respective fields, but the point here is that many did not stay within their respective fields. As George J. Stigler said of some of his fellow Nobel laureates, they issue stern ultimata to the public on almost a monthly basis, and sometimes on no other basis. The fatal misstep of such intellectuals is assuming that superior ability within a particular realm can be generalized as superior wisdom or morality overall. Chess grandmasters, musical prodigies, and others who are as remarkable within their respective specialties as intellectuals are within theirs, seldom make that mistake. Here it is sufficient to make a sharp distinction between the intellectual occupation and intellectual standards which members of that occupation can and do violate, especially in their roles as public intellectuals, making pronouncements about society and advocating government policies. What was said of John Maynard Keynes by his biographer and fellow economist Ray Herod could be said of many other intellectuals. He held forth on a great range of topics, on some of which he was thoroughly expert, but on others of which he may have derived his views from the few pages of a book at which he had happened to glance. The air of authority was the same in both cases. Competing concepts of knowledge. The way the word knowledge is used by many intellectuals often arbitrarily limits what verified information is to be considered knowledge. This arbitrary limitation of the scope of the word was expressed in a parody verse about Benjamin Jowett, master of Balliol College at Oxford University. "My name is Benjamin Jowett. If it's knowledge, I know it. I am the master of this college. What I don't know isn't knowledge." Someone who is considered to be a knowledgeable person usually has a special kind of knowledge, perhaps academic or other kinds of knowledge not widely found in the population at large. Someone who has even more knowledge of more mundane things, plumbing, carpentry, or baseball, for example, is less likely to be called knowledgeable by those intellectuals for whom what they don't know isn't knowledge. Although the special kind of knowledge associated with intellectuals is usually valued more, and those who have such knowledge are usually accorded more prestige, it is by no means certain that the kind of knowledge mastered by intellectuals is necessarily more consequential in its effects in the real world. The same is true even of expert knowledge. No doubt those in charge of the Titanic had far more expertise in the many aspects of seafaring than most ordinary people had, but what was crucial in its consequences was the mundane knowledge of where particular icebergs happened to be located on a particular night. Many major economic decisions are likewise crucially dependent on the kind of mundane knowledge that intellectuals might disdain to consider to be knowledge, in the sense in which they habitually use the word. Location is just one of those mundane kinds of knowledge, and its importance is by no means confined to the location of icebergs. For example, the mundane knowledge of what is located at Broadway and 23rd Street in Manhattan, and what the surrounding neighborhood is like, may not be considered relevant to determining whether a given individual should be regarded as a knowledgeable person. But for a business seeking a place to open a store, that knowledge can be the difference between going bankrupt and making millions of dollars. Enterprises invest much time and money in determining where to locate their operations, and these locations are by no means random. It is not accidental that filling stations are often located on street corners, and often near other filling stations, just as automobile dealers are often located near other automobile dealers. But stationery stores are seldom located near other stationery stores. People knowledgeable about business have cited as one of the factors behind the spectacular rise of Starbucks the Starbucks management's careful attention to choosing the locations of their outlets, and one of the factors cited in Starbucks having to close hundreds of outlets in 2008 has been their straying from that practice. It is a cliché among realtors that the three most important factors in determining the value of a house are location, location, and location. Location is just one of many mundane facts with major and often decisive consequences. A nurse's mundane knowledge of whether a particular patient is allergic to penicillin can be the difference between life and death. When a plane is coming into an airport for a landing, the control tower's observation that the pilot has forgotten to lower the landing gear is information whose immediate conveyance to the pilot can likewise be crucial, even though such knowledge requires nothing more intellectually challenging than eyesight. Foreknowledge that the D-Day invasion of Europe would take place at Normandy rather than at Calais, where Hitler expected it, would have led to a wholly different concentration of the Nazis' military forces, costing thousands more lives among the troops hitting the beach, perhaps dooming the whole operation and changing the course of the war. In short, much of the special kind of knowledge concentrated among intellectuals may not have as weighty consequences as much mundane or intellectually unimpressive knowledge scattered among the population at large. In the aggregate, mundane knowledge can vastly outweigh the special knowledge of elites, both in its amount and in its consequences. While special knowledge is almost invariably articulated knowledge, other kinds of knowledge need not be articulated to others, nor even be consciously articulated to ourselves. Friedrich Hayek included in knowledge all the human adaptations to environment in which past experience has been incorporated. He added, "Not all knowledge in this sense is part of our intellect, nor is our intellect the whole of our knowledge. Our habits and skills, our emotional attitudes, our tools, and our institutions, all are in this sense adaptations to past experience, which have grown up by selective elimination of less suitable conduct. They are as much an indispensable foundation of successful action as is our conscious knowledge." Concentration and dispersion of knowledge. When both special knowledge and mundane knowledge are encompassed within the concept of knowledge, it is doubtful whether the most knowledgeable person on earth has even 1% of the total knowledge on earth, or even 1% of the consequential knowledge in a given society. There are many serious implications of this, which may, among other things, help explain why so many leading intellectuals have so often backed notions that prove to be disastrous. It is not simply with particular policies at particular times that intellectuals have often advocated mistaken and dangerous decisions. Their whole general approach to policy-making, their ideology, has often reflected a crucial misconception about knowledge and its concentration or dispersion. Many intellectuals and their followers have been unduly impressed by the fact that highly educated elites, like themselves, have far more knowledge per capita, in the sense of special knowledge, than does the population at large. From this, it is a short step to considering the educated elites to be superior guides to what should and should not be done in a society. They have often overlooked the crucial fact that the population at large may have vastly more total knowledge, in the mundane sense, than the elites, even if that knowledge is scattered in individually unimpressive fragments among vast numbers of people. If no one has even 1% of the knowledge currently available, not counting the vast amounts of knowledge yet to be discovered, the imposition from the top down of the notions in favor among elites, convinced of their own superior knowledge and virtue, is a formula for disaster. Sometimes it is economic disaster, which central planning, for example, turned out to be in so many countries around the world during the 20th century that even most governments run by communists and socialists began replacing such top-down economic planning by freer markets by the end of that century. No doubt central planners had far more expertise and far more statistical data at their command than the average person making transactions in the market. Yet the vastly greater mundane knowledge brought to bear by millions of ordinary people making their own mutual accommodations among themselves almost invariably produced higher economic growth rates and higher standards of living after central planning was jettisoned, notably in China and India, where rates of poverty declined dramatically as their economies grew at accelerated rates. Central planning is just one of a more general class of social decision-making processes dependent on the underlying assumption that people with more per capita knowledge, in the special sense, should be guiding their societies. Other forms of this general notion include judicial activism, urban planning, and other institutional expressions of the belief that social decisions cannot be left to be determined by the actions and values of the less knowledgeable population at large. But if no one has even 1% of all the knowledge in a society, in the larger sense in which many different kinds of knowledge are consequential, then it is crucial that the other 99% of knowledge, scattered in small and individually unimpressive amounts among the population at large, be allowed the freedom to be used in working out mutual accommodations among the people themselves. These innumerable interactions and mutual accommodations are what bring the other 99% of knowledge into play, and generate new knowledge in the process of back-and-forth bids, reflecting changes in supply and demand. That is why free markets, judicial restraint, and reliance on decisions and traditions growing out of the experiences of the many, rather than the presumptions of an elite few, are so important to those who do not share the social vision prevalent among intellectual elites. In short, ideological fault lines divide those who have different conceptions of the meaning of knowledge, and who consequently see knowledge as being concentrated or dispersed. In general, the market is smarter than the smartest of its individual participants, is the way the late Robert L. Bartley, editor of the Wall Street Journal, expressed his belief that systemic processes can bring into play more knowledge for decision-making purposes through the interactions and mutual accommodations of many individuals than any one of those individuals possesses. Systemic processes are essentially trial-and-error processes, with repeated or continuous and consequential feedback from those involved in these processes. By contrast, political and legal processes are processes in which initial decisions are harder to change, whether because of the high cost to political careers of admitting a mistake, or, in the law, the legal precedents that are set. Why the transfer of decisions from those with personal experience and a stake in the outcome to those with neither can be expected to lead to better decisions is a question seldom asked, much less answered. Given the greater cost of correcting surrogate decisions compared to correcting individual decisions, and the greater cost of persisting in mistaken decisions by those making decisions for themselves, compared to the lower cost of making mistaken decisions for others, the economic success of market economies is hardly surprising, and neither are the counterproductive and often disastrous results of various forms of social engineering. People on both sides of the ideological fault line may believe that those with the most knowledge should have the most weight in making decisions that impact society, but they have radically different conceptions of just where in society there is in fact the most knowledge. If knowledge is defined expansively, including much mundane knowledge, whose presence or absence is consequential and often crucial, then individuals with PhDs are as grossly ignorant of most consequential things as other individuals are, since no one can be truly knowledgeable at a level required for consequential decision-making for a whole society, except within a narrow band out of the vast spectrum of human concerns. The ignorance, prejudices, and groupthink of an educated elite are still ignorance, prejudice, and groupthink, and for those with 1% of the knowledge in a society to be guiding or controlling those with the other 99% is as perilous as it is absurd. The difference between special knowledge and mundane knowledge is not simply incidental or semantic. Its social implications are very consequential. For example, it is far easier to concentrate power than to concentrate knowledge. That is why so much social engineering backfires, and why so many despots have led their countries into disasters. Where knowledge is conceived of as Hayek conceived of it, to include knowledge unarticulated even to ourselves, but expressed in our individual habits and social customs, then the transmission of such knowledge from millions of people to be concentrated in surrogate decision-makers becomes very problematic, if not impossible, since many of those operating with such knowledge have not fully articulated such knowledge even to themselves, and so can hardly transmit it to others, even if they might wish to. Since many, if not most intellectuals, operate under the implicit assumption that knowledge is already concentrated in people like themselves, they are especially susceptible to the idea that a corresponding concentration of decision-making power in a public-spirited elite can benefit society. That assumption has been the foundation for reform movements like progressivism in the United States and revolutionary movements in various other countries around the world. Moreover, with sufficient knowledge being considered already concentrated, those with this view often conceive that what needs to be done is to create an accompanying will and power to deal collectively with a wide array of social problems. Emphasis on will, commitment, caring, or compassion as crucial ingredients for dealing with social issues essentially assumes away the question whether those who are presumed to have these qualities also have sufficient knowledge. Sometimes the sufficiency of knowledge is explicitly asserted, and any questions about that sufficiency are then dismissed as reflecting either ignorance or obstruction. John Dewey, for example, spelled it out. Having the knowledge, we may set hopefully at work upon a course of social invention and experimental engineering. But the ignored question is, who, if anybody, has that kind of knowledge? Since intellectuals have every incentive to emphasize the importance of the special kind of knowledge that they have, relative to the mundane knowledge that others have, they are often advocates of courses of action which ignore the value, the cost, and the consequences of mundane knowledge. It is common, for example, for the intelligentsia to deplore many methods of sorting and labeling things and people, often saying in the case of people that each person should be judged as an individual. The cost of the knowledge necessary to do that is almost never considered. Lower-cost substitutes for that knowledge of individuals, ranging from credit reports to IQ tests, are used precisely because judging the whole person means acquiring and weighing vast amounts of knowledge at vast costs that can include delayed decisions in circumstances where time is crucial. Depending on how expansively judging the whole person is defined, the time required can exceed the human lifespan, which would make it impossible for all practical purposes. Armies sort people into ranks, colleges sort applicants into ranges of SAT scores, and virtually everyone else sorts people by innumerable other criteria. Many, if not most of these sorting methods are criticized by the intelligentsia, who fail to appreciate the scarcity and high cost of knowledge, and the necessity of making consequential decisions despite that scarcity and high cost, which necessarily includes the costs of mistakes. The risks of making decisions with incomplete knowledge, there being no other kind, are part of the tragedy of the human condition. However, that has not stopped intellectuals from criticizing the inherent risks that turn out badly in everything from pharmaceutical drugs to military operations, nor does it stop them from helping create a general atmosphere of unfulfillable expectations, in which the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to become 1,000 bases for lawsuits. Without some sense of the tragedy of the human condition, it is all too easy to consider anything that goes wrong as being somebody's fault. It is common for intellectuals to act as if their special kind of knowledge of generalities can and should substitute for and override the mundane specific knowledge of others. This emphasis on the special knowledge of intellectuals often leads to the dismissing of mundane first-hand knowledge as prejudices or stereotypes in favor of abstract beliefs common among the intelligentsia, who may have little or no first-hand knowledge of the individuals, organizations, or concrete circumstances involved. Moreover, such attitudes are not only disseminated far beyond the ranks of the intelligentsia, they have become the basis of policies, laws, and judicial decisions. One small but revealing example of the social consequences of this attitude is that many company policies of establishing retirement ages for their employees have been made illegal as age discrimination, because those policies are said to be based on stereotypes about the elderly, who can be productive beyond the age of mandatory retirement. In other words, third parties with no stake in the outcome, no direct experience in the particular companies or industries, and no knowledge of the particular individual employees involved, are assumed to have superior understanding of the effects of age than those who do have such experience, such a stake, and such direct knowledge, mundane though that knowledge may be. Moreover, employers have economic incentives to hang on to productive employees, especially since they must pay costs to recruit their replacements and invest in bringing those replacements up to speed, while surrogate decision-makers pay no cost whatever for being mistaken. The very phrase, mandatory retirement, shows the verbal virtuosity of the intelligentsia, and what a fatal talent that can be in obscuring rather than clarifying rational analysis. There has seldom, if ever, been any such thing as mandatory retirement. Particular employers had set an age beyond which they automatically ceased to employ people. Those people remained free to go work elsewhere, and many did. Even within a company with an automatic retirement policy, those particular employees who clearly remained productive and valuable could find the retirement policy waived, either for a particular span of time or indefinitely. But such waivers would be based on specific knowledge of specific individuals, not abstract generalities about how productive older people can be. Virtually all adverse conclusions about any ethnic minority are likewise dismissed as prejudices, stereotypes, and the like by the intelligentsia. For example, a biographer of Theodore Roosevelt said, "During his years as a rancher, Roosevelt had acquired plenty of anti-Indian prejudice, strangely at odds with his enlightened attitude to blacks." Here was a writer, nearly 100 years removed from the particular Indians that Theodore Roosevelt dealt with personally in the West, declaring a priori that Roosevelt's conclusions were mistaken and based on prejudice, even while conceding that racial prejudice was not a general feature of TR's outlook. It would probably never occur to that writer that it was he who was reaching a conclusion based on prejudgment, prejudice, even if it was a prejudice common among intellectuals, while Theodore Roosevelt's conclusions were based on his own direct personal experience with particular individuals. Many intellectuals seem unwilling to concede that the man on the scene at the time could reach accurate conclusions about the particular individuals he encountered or observed, and that the intellectuals far removed in space and time could be mistaken when reaching conclusions based on their own shared preconceptions. Another writer, even further removed in space and time, dismissed as prejudice Cicero's advice to his fellow Romans not to buy British slaves because they were so hard to teach. Considering the enormous difference between the primitive, illiterate, tribal world of the Britons of that era and the sophisticated world of the Romans, it is hard to imagine how a Briton taken in bondage to Rome could comprehend the complex circumstances, methods, and expectations of such a radically different society. But the very possibility that Cicero might have known what he was talking about from direct experience received no attention from the writer who dubbed him prejudiced without further ado. A much more recent example of intellectuals dismissing the first-hand experience of others in favor of prevailing assumptions among themselves involved nationally publicized charges of rape filed against 3 students at Duke University in 2006. These students were members of the men's lacrosse team, and in the wave of condemnation that instantly swept the campus and the media, the only defenders of these students at the outset were members of the women's lacrosse team. These particular women had long associated socially with the accused men, and were adamant from the beginning that the 3 young men in question were not the kind of people to do what they were accused of. Since this case involved race as well as rape, it should also be noted that a black woman on the lacrosse team took the lead in defending these men's character. In the absence of any evidence on either side of the issue at the outset, there was no reason why unsubstantiated statements for or against the accused should have been uncritically accepted or uncritically rejected. But the statements of members of the women's lacrosse team were not merely dismissed, but denounced. The Duke women lacrosse players were characterized as stupid, spoiled little girls, in remarks quoted in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, people who negate common sense, according to a New York Times writer, who were dumb, according to a writer in the Philadelphia Daily News, and ignorant or insensitive, according to a Philadelphia Inquirer writer. In other words, members of the intelligentsia, hundreds of miles away, who had never laid eyes on the men in question, were so convinced of their guilt, on the basis of commonly shared a priori notions among the intelligentsia, that they could assail young women who had had direct personal knowledge of the individuals in question, including their attitudes and behavior toward women in general and a black woman in particular. It was a classic example of the presumption of superior knowledge on the part of intellectuals with less knowledge than those whose conclusions they dismissed and denounced. Unfortunately, it was not the only example, nor even a rare example. Experts. A special occupation which overlaps that of intellectuals, but is not wholly coincident with it, is that of the expert. One may, after all, be an expert on Spanish literature or existentialist philosophy, where one's end product in either case consists of ideas, or one may be an expert on repairing automobile transmissions or extinguishing oil field fires, where the end product is a service rendered. Obviously, only the former experts would fit our definition of intellectuals. Experts of whatever sort are especially clear examples of people whose knowledge is concentrated within a narrow band out of the vast spectrum of human concerns. Moreover, the interactions of innumerable factors in the real world mean that, even within that narrow band, factors from outside that band can sometimes affect outcomes in ways that mean an expert whose expertise does not encompass those other factors can be an amateur when it comes to making consequential decisions, even within what is normally thought of as that expert's field of expertise. For example, in early 20th century America, experts on forestry predicted a timber famine that never materialized because these forestry experts did not know enough economics to understand how prices allocate resources over time, as well as allocating resources among alternative users at a given time. Similar hysteria about an impending exhaustion of other natural resources, such as oil, has flourished for well over a century, despite repeated predictions that we had only enough oil reserves to last for a dozen or so years, and repeated experiences that there were more known oil reserves at the end of the dozen or so years than there were at the beginning. With experts, as with non-profit organizations or movements with idealistic-sounding names, there is often an implication of disinterested endeavors, uncorrupted by the bias of self-interest. This is one of many perceptions which cannot survive empirical scrutiny, but which is seldom subjected to such scrutiny. Quite aside from the vested interest that experts have in the use of expertise, rather than other economic or other social mechanisms, to shape consequential decisions, there is much empirical evidence of their biases. City planners are a typical example. Planners often call for visioning sessions, in which the public are consulted about their desires for their regions. In a typical visioning session, members of the public are asked leading questions about their preferences. Would you like to have more or less pollution? Would you like to spend more or less time commuting? Would you like to live in an ugly neighborhood or a pretty one? Planners interpret the answers as support for their preconceived notions, usually some form of smart growth. If you want less pollution, you must want less auto driving. If you want to spend less time getting to work, you must want a denser city so you live closer to work. If you want apple pie, you must oppose urban sprawl that might subdivide the apple orchard. Quite aside from the tendentiousness of the questions, even an honest attempt to get meaningful input into a decision-making process from answers to questions that neither cost anything to answer nor even include any notion of costs in the questions would be relevant only to a costless world, while the crucial fact of the world we live in is that all actions or inactions entail costs which have to be taken into account in order to reach a rational decision. Rational is used here in its most basic sense, the ability to make a ratio, as in rational numbers in mathematics, so that rational decisions are decisions that weigh one thing against another, a trade-off, as distinguished from a crusade to achieve some good thing without weighing costs. City planners, like other experts, are also well aware that their own incomes and careers depend on providing ideas that are saleable to those who employ them, including politicians, whose goals and methods become the experts' goals and methods. Even where experts go through the formality of weighing costs against benefits, that can remain only a formality in a process where a goal has been chosen politically. For example, after a planning expert was ordered by a politician who wanted a rail system built to revise rail ridership estimates upward and costs downward, later cost overruns and revenue shortfalls became a public scandal. But the politician was able to say, "It's not my fault. I relied on forecasts made by our staff, and they seem to have made a big mistake." In other words, experts are often called in not to provide factual information or dispassionate analysis for the purpose of decision-making by responsible officials, but to give political cover for decisions already made and based on other considerations entirely. the shifting of socially consequential decisions from systemic processes involving millions of people making mutual accommodations at their own costs and risks to experts imposing a master plan on all would be problematic even if the experts were free to render their own best judgment. In situations where experts are simply part of the window dressing, concealing arbitrary and even corrupt decisions by others, reliance on what all the experts say about a given issue is extremely risky. Even where the experts are untrammeled, what all the experts are most likely to agree on is the need for using expertise to deal with problems. Experts have their place and can be extremely valuable in those places, this no doubt being one reason for the old expression, experts should be on tap, not on top. For broader social decision-making, however, experts are no substitute for systemic processes which engage innumerable factors on which no given individual can possibly be expert, and engage the 99% of consequential knowledge scattered in fragments among the population at large and coordinated systemically during the process of their mutual accommodations to one another's demand and supply. The simple fact that central planners in the Soviet Union had more than 24 million prices to set shows the absurdity of the task undertaken by central planning. That central planning has failed repeatedly in countries around the world, among both democracies and dictatorships, can hardly be surprising because the central planners could not possibly be experts, or even competent, on all the things under their control. The fact that central planning was abandoned by country after country in the late 20th century, even in countries with communist or socialist governments, suggests the depth and undeniability of that failure. Economic central planning is just one aspect of top-down social engineering in general, but bad outcomes in other fields are not always so blatantly obvious, so readily quantifiable, and so undeniable as in the economy, though these other social outcomes may be just as bad or worse. While lawyers and judges are experts on legal principles and have valuable roles to play within their expertise, both have, over the years, increasingly moved beyond those roles to using law as an instrument of social change, which is to say, making amateur decisions on complex matters extending far beyond the narrow boundaries of their professional expertise. Moreover, the consensus of like-minded experts on matters beyond their expertise has emboldened many legal experts, like experts in other fields, to imagine that the difference between their elite group perceptions and those of other people is almost axiomatically a difference between knowledgeable people and the uninformed masses. Among the many examples of this attitude was a 1960s judicial conference, where a retired police commissioner attempted to explain to the judges and law professors present how the court's recent expansions of criminals' legal rights undermined the effectiveness of law enforcement. Among those present were Supreme Court Justice William J. Brennan and Chief Justice Earl Warren, both of whom remained stony-faced during the police commissioner's presentation, according to a New York Times account, but later roared with laughter after a law professor arose to pour ridicule on what the police commissioner had just said. Yet such scornful dismissal was not based on any factual evidence, and evidence subsequently accumulating over the years made painfully clear that law enforcement was in fact breaking down, to an accompanying skyrocketing of crime rates. Prior to the revolution in judicial interpretations of criminal law in the early 1960s, the murder rate in the United States had been going down for decades, and was by 1961 less than half of what it had been back in 1933. But this long downward trend in murder rates suddenly reversed during the 1960s, and by 1974 the murder rate was double what it was in 1961. Yet here, as elsewhere, the first-hand observations and years of personal day-to-day experience, in this case by a retired police commissioner, were not merely dismissed but ridiculed by people who relied instead on shared but unsubstantiated assumptions among the elite. Neither this issue nor this episode was unique as an example of those with the vision of the anointed scornfully dismissing alternative views instead of answering them. The role of reason. There are as many conceptions of reason and its social role as there are conceptions of knowledge and its social role. Both merit scrutiny. Reason and justification. The implicit assumption of superior knowledge among intellectual elites underlies one of the demands of intellectuals that goes back at least as far as the 18th century, namely that actions, policies, or institutions justify themselves before the bar of reason. The words in which this demand is expressed have changed since the 18th century, but the basic premise has not. Many intellectuals today, for example, find it a weighty consideration that they do not understand how corporate executives can be worth such high salaries as they receive, as if there is any inherent reason why third parties should be expected to understand, or why their understanding or acquiescence should be necessary in order for those who are directly involved in hiring and paying corporate executives to proceed on the basis of their own knowledge and experience in a matter in which they have a stake and intellectuals do not. Some try to claim that as consumers who buy the products of the companies whose executives receive high pay, they are affected in the prices of the products they buy. However, if all the executives of oil companies, for example, agreed to work for no salary at all, that would not be enough to reduce the price of a gallon of gasoline by a dime, since the total profits of the oil companies are a small fraction of the price of a gallon of gasoline, usually much less than the taxes levied by governments at state and national levels. Similarly, many of the intelligentsia expressed not only surprise but outrage at the number of shots fired by the police in some confrontation with a criminal, even if many of these intellectuals have never fired a gun in their lives, much less faced life-and-death dangers requiring split-second decisions. Seldom, if ever, do the intelligentsia find it necessary to seek out any information on the accuracy of pistols when fired under stress before venting their feelings and demanding changes. In reality, a study by the New York City Police Department found that even within a range of only 6 feet, just over half the shots fired by police missed completely. At distances from 16 to 25 yards, less than the distance from first base to second base on a baseball diamond, only 14% of the shots hit. However surprising such facts might be to those who have never fired a pistol, even at a stationary target in the safety and calm of a pistol range, much less in the scramble and stress of life-and-death dangers with moving targets, what is crucial here is that so many of the intelligentsia, and those whom they influence, have seen no reason to seek such factual information before venting their outrage in utter ignorance of the facts. Moreover, even a criminal who is hit by a bullet is not necessarily rendered instantly harmless, so there is no reason to stop firing, so long as that criminal continues to be a danger. But such mundane knowledge has been of no interest to those joining elite group expressions of indignation over things beyond their experience or competence. As a personal note, I once taught pistol shooting in the Marine Corps, and have not been at all surprised by the number of shots fired by the police. To demand that things justify themselves before the bar of reason, in a world where no one has even 1% of all consequential knowledge, is to demand that ignorance be convinced and its permission obtained. How can a brain surgeon justify what he does to someone who knows nothing about the brain or about surgery? How can a carpenter justify his choice of nails and wood to people who know nothing about carpentry, especially if the carpenter is being accused of wrongdoing by lawyers or politicians, whose articulation skills may greatly exceed those of the carpenter, while their knowledge of carpentry is far less? The confidence born of their generally superior special knowledge may conceal from these elites themselves the extent of their ignorance and the resulting misconception of the issue at hand. Moreover, arguments against the carpenter by articulate but ignorant elites to a general public that is equally ignorant on this subject, whether the public are on juries or in election booths, may easily prove to be convincing, even if those same arguments would seem absurd to other carpenters. It is one thing for the population at large to make their own individual transactions and accommodations on matters pertaining to themselves individually, and something quite different for them to make collective decisions for the society at large. Collective decision-making, whether through democratic processes or through top-down commands, involves people making decisions for other people, rather than for themselves. The same problem of inadequate knowledge afflicts both these processes. To revert for a moment to central planning as a proxy for surrogate decision-making in general, when central planners in the days of the Soviet Union had to set more than 24 million prices, it was an impossible task for any manageably sized group of central planners, but far less of a problem in a country with hundreds of millions of people, each making decisions about the relatively few prices relevant to their own economic transactions. Incentives as well as knowledge are different. There are far more incentives to invest time and attention in decisions with major direct personal consequences to oneself than to invest similar amounts of time and attention to casting one vote among millions in decisions that will affect mostly other people, and whose effect on oneself is unlikely to be changed by how one's own single vote among millions is cast. The notion that things must justify themselves before the bar of reason opens the floodgates to sweeping condemnations of things not understood by people with credentialed ignorance. Differences in incomes and occupations not understood by intellectual elites, usually without much knowledge of either the mundane specifics or of economics in general, readily become disparities and inequities without further ado, just as intellectuals who have never fired a gun in their lives do not hesitate to express their outrage at the number of bullets fired by the police in a confrontation with a criminal. In these and other ways, notions trump knowledge, when these are notions prevalent among intellectuals. This key fallacy, and the bad social consequences to which it can lead, is not limited to intellectual elites. The squelching of individual decision-making by the imposition of collective decisions arrived at by third parties, whether those third parties are elites or masses, usually means essentially allowing ignorance to overrule knowledge. A public opinion poll or a popular vote on an issue involving carpentry would be as irrelevant as the views prevalent in elite circles. The only saving grace is that the masses are much less likely than the elites to think that they should be overruling people whose stake and whose relevant knowledge for the issue at hand are far greater than their own. Moreover, the masses are less likely to have the rhetorical skills to conceal from others, or from themselves, that this is what they are doing. The intellectual's exaltation of reason often comes at the expense of experience, allowing them to have sweeping confidence about things in which they have little or no knowledge or experience. The idea that what they don't know isn't knowledge may also be a factor in many references to earlier and simpler times by people who have made no detailed study of those times, and who are unlikely even to suspect that it is their knowledge of the complexities of those times which is lacking, not the complexities themselves. Oliver Wendell Holmes pointed out that Roman law contained a set of technicalities more difficult and less understood than our own. Central planners are not the only elites whose special knowledge has proved less effective in practice than the vastly greater amount of mundane knowledge in the population at large, nor is the economic marketplace the only place where the knowledge imbalance between the elites and the masses can be the opposite of the way this imbalance is perceived by the elites. If, as Oliver Wendell Holmes said, the life of the law has not been logic but experience, then here too it is the millions, and especially the successive generations of millions, who have vastly more knowledge in the form of personal experience than do the relatively small circles of experts in the law. This is not to say that experts have no role to play, whether in the law or in other aspects of life, but the nature of that role is very different when both elite expertise and mass experience must be combined. Within a sufficiently circumscribed area of decision-making, experts on that particular circumscribed area can have a vital role to play. The few with legal expertise can make court decisions applying the laws that developed out of the experiences of the many. But that is fundamentally different from creating or changing the law to suit the notions of judges, or the notions in vogue among law school professors. Likewise, someone with the special talents and skills to collect information and convey it to the public through the media can be an indispensable part of the functioning of a democratic society, but that is wholly different from journalists taking on the role of filtering and slanting the news to buttress conclusions reflecting notions common within journalistic circles, as will be documented in Chapter 5. The difference between the carrying out of circumscribed roles and using those roles to exert power or influence to try to shape wider social decisions also applies to those teachers who are classroom indoctrinators or those religious leaders promoting liberation theology, as well as generals who displace civilian government with military coups. What the various non-military ambitious elites are doing is creating smaller and more numerous coups, preempting social decisions that others have been authorized to make, in order to acquire power or influence in matters for which they have neither expertise, nor, in many cases, even simple competence. In short, whether one stays within a circumscribed role, based on one's expertise, or ventures beyond that role into areas beyond one's expertise, depends in part on whether one presumes oneself to have more knowledge than those whose decisions are being preempted. How knowledge is seen affects how society is seen, and how one's own role within that society is seen. One day at a time rationalism. Intellectuals' faith in reason sometimes takes the form of believing themselves capable of deciding each issue ad hoc as it arises. In principle, reason can be applied to as limited or as expansive a time period as one wishes, a day, a year, a generation, or a century, for example, by analyzing the implications of decisions over whatever span of time may be chosen. One day at a time rationalism risks restricting its analysis to the immediate implications of each issue as it arises, missing wider implications of a decision that may have merit as regards the issue immediately at hand, considered in isolation, but which can be disastrous in terms of the ignored longer-term repercussions. A classic example was a French intellectual's response to the Czechoslovakian crisis that led to the Munich Conference of 1938. An eminent French political scientist, Joseph Barthélemy, who taught constitutional law at the University of Paris and was French representative at the League of Nations, asked in Le Temps the question French leaders had to answer: is it worthwhile setting fire to the world in order to save the Czechoslovak state, a heap of different nationalities? Is it necessary that 3 million Frenchmen, all the youth of our universities, of our schools, our countryside, and our factories, would be sacrificed to maintain 3 million Germans under Czech sovereignty? Since it was not France that was threatening to set fire to the world, but Hitler, the larger question was whether someone who was threatening to set fire to the world if he didn't get his way was someone who should be appeased in this one-day-at-a-time approach, without regard to what this appeasement could do to encourage a never-ending series of escalating demands. By contrast, Winston Churchill had pointed out 6 years earlier that every concession which has been made to Germany has been followed immediately by a fresh demand. Churchill clearly rejected one-day-at-a-time rationalism. By the time that Barthélemy addressed the Czechoslovakian crisis, Hitler had already taken the crucial step toward preparing for war by remilitarizing the Rhineland, in defiance of treaty commitments, had initiated military conscription when there was no military threat against Germany, and had seized Austria by force. As Winston Churchill said at the time, Europe is confronted with a program of aggression, nicely calculated and timed, unfolding stage by stage. This raised the longer-run question posed by Churchill: how many friends would be alienated? How many potential allies should we see go, one by one, down the grisly gulf? How many times would bluff succeed, until behind bluff ever-gathering forces had accumulated reality? In short, the handwriting was on the wall for anyone who wanted to read it, and presenting the immediate Czechoslovakian crisis in isolation was one way of not facing the implications of a series of actions over a longer span of time, leading toward a growing threat as more and more resources came under the control of Nazi Germany, increasing its military potential. That threat would be even greater with the significant resources of Czechoslovakia under Hitler's control, as France would discover just 2 years later, when an invading German army battered them into quick submission using, among other things, tanks manufactured in Czechoslovakia. The one-day-at-a-time approach has been applied to numerous issues, foreign and domestic. At the heart of this approach is the implicit notion that intellectuals can define an issue in ways they find convenient, and that what happens in the real world will remain within the confines of their definition. But time is just one of the many things that can move beyond the boundaries of man-made definitions and conceptions. For example, however humane it may seem to have forgiveness of loans to third-world countries, at least in a one-day-at-a-time perspective, what happens today affects how people will behave tomorrow. In this case, third-world countries repeatedly borrow money that they repeatedly do not repay, either because of explicit forgiveness or because international aid agencies allow them to repeatedly borrow ever larger amounts, using the proceeds of later loans to pay off previous loans, but with no end in sight as far as ever paying off any loan with their own resources. Fiscal irresponsibility has seldom provided a way out of poverty, whether for individuals or for nations. Hurricanes in Florida and wildfires in Southern California are likewise recurrent phenomena over the years, but each individual natural catastrophe is treated as an immediate and discrete crisis, bringing not only government rescue efforts, but also vast amounts of the taxpayers' money to enable people who live in these places to rebuild in the known path of these dangers. An economist has estimated that the cost of rebuilding New Orleans was enough to instead give every New Orleans family of 4 $800,000, which they would be free to use to relocate to some safer place. But the idea of not rebuilding New Orleans has been seen as part of the apparently heartless reaction of many urban economists to the devastation of New Orleans. Any administration which might refuse to saddle taxpayers with the huge costs of subsidizing the rebuilding would no doubt be roundly condemned, not only by its political opponents, but also by much of the media and the intelligentsia, looking at each particular hurricane or wildfire in a one-day-at-a-time perspective, rather than as part of an ongoing sequence with a long history and a predictable future. With a long history and a predictable future. Chapter 3. Intellectuals and Economics. Whether one is a conservative or a radical, a protectionist or a free trader, a cosmopolitan or a nationalist, a churchman or a heathen, it is useful to know the causes and consequences of economic phenomena. George J. Stigler. Most intellectuals outside the field of economics show remarkably little interest in learning even the basic fundamentals of economics. Yet they do not hesitate to make sweeping pronouncements about the economy in general, businesses in particular, and the many issues revolving around what is called income distribution. Famed novelist John Steinbeck, for example, commented on the many American fortunes which have been donated to philanthropic causes by saying, "One has only to remember some of the wolfish financiers who spent 2/3 of their lives clawing a fortune out of the guts of society, and the latter third pushing it back." Despite the verbal virtuosity involved in creating a vivid vision of profits as having been clawed out of the guts of society, neither Steinbeck nor most other intellectuals have bothered to demonstrate how society has been made poorer by the activities of Carnegie, Ford, or Rockefeller, for example, all three of whom, and many others, made fortunes by reducing the prices of their products below the prices of competing products. Lower prices made these products affordable to more people, simultaneously increasing those people's standard of living and creating fortunes for sellers who greatly expanded the numbers of their customers. In short, this was a process in which wealth was created, not a process by which some could get rich only by making others poorer. Nevertheless, negative images of market processes have been evoked with such phrases as robber barons and economic royalists, without answering such obvious questions as, just who did the robber barons rob when they lowered their prices? Or, how is earning money, often starting from modest circumstances, or even poverty-stricken circumstances in the case of J.C. Penney and F.W. Woolworth, the same as simply inheriting wealth and power like royalty? The issue here is not the adequacy or inadequacy of intellectuals' answers to such questions, because in most cases such questions are not even asked, much less answered. The vision, in effect, serves as a substitute for both facts and questions. This is not to suggest that nobody in business ever did anything wrong. Saints have been no more common in corporate suites than in government offices or in ivy-covered campuses. However, the question here is not one of individual culpability for particular misdeeds. The question raised by critics of business and its defenders alike has been about the merits or demerits of alternative institutional processes for serving the economic interests of society at large. Implicit in many criticisms of market processes by intellectuals is the assumption that these are zero-sum processes, in which what is gained by some is lost by others. Seldom is this assumption spelled out, but without it, much of what is spelled out would have no basis. Perhaps the biggest economic issue, or the one addressed most often, is that of what is called income distribution, though the phrase itself is misleading, and the conclusions about income reached by most of the intelligentsia are still more misleading. Income distribution. Variations in income can be viewed empirically on the one hand, or in terms of moral judgments on the other. Most of the contemporary intelligentsia do both. But in order to assess the validity of the conclusions they reach, it is advisable to assess the empirical issues and the moral issues separately, rather than attempt to go back and forth between the two with any expectation of rational coherence. Empirical evidence. Given the vast amounts of statistical data on income available from the Census Bureau, the Internal Revenue Service, and innumerable research institutes and projects, one might imagine that the bare facts about variations in income would be fairly well known by informed people, even though they might have differing opinions as to the desirability of those particular variations. In reality, however, the most fundamental facts are in dispute, and variations in what are claimed to be facts seem to be at least as great as variations in incomes. Both the magnitude of income variations and the trends in these variations over time are seen in radically different terms by those with different visions as regards the current reality, even aside from what different people may regard as desirable for the future. Perhaps the most fertile source of misunderstandings about incomes has been the widespread practice of confusing statistical categories with flesh-and-blood human beings. Many statements have been made in the media and in academia, claiming that the rich are gaining not only larger incomes but a growing share of all incomes, widening the income gap between people at the top and those at the bottom. Almost invariably, these statements are based on confusing what has been happening over time in statistical categories with what has been happening over time with actual flesh-and-blood people. A New York Times editorial, for example, declared that the gap between rich and poor has widened in America. Similar conclusions appeared in a 2007 Newsweek article, which referred to this era as a time when the gap is growing between the rich and the poor, and the super-rich and the merely rich, a theme common in such other well-known media outlets as the Washington Post and innumerable television programs. The rich have seen far greater income gains than have the poor, according to Washington Post columnist Eugene Robinson. A writer in the Los Angeles Times likewise declared, "The gap between rich and poor is growing." According to Professor Andrew Hacker in his book Money, while all segments of the population enjoyed an increase in income, the top fifth did 24 times better than the bottom fifth, and measured by their shares of the aggregate, not just the bottom fifth, but the three above it all ended up losing ground. Although such discussions have been phrased in terms of people, the actual empirical evidence cited has been about what has been happening over time to statistical categories, and that turns out to be the direct opposite of what has happened over time to flesh-and-blood human beings, most of whom move from one category to another over time. In terms of statistical categories, it is indeed true that both the amount of income and the proportion of all income received by those in the top 20% bracket have risen over the years, widening the gap between the top and bottom quintiles. But U.S. Treasury Department data, following specific individuals over time from their tax returns to the Internal Revenue Service, shows that in terms of people, the incomes of those particular taxpayers who were in the bottom 20% in income in 1996 rose 91% by 2005, while the incomes of those particular taxpayers who were in the top 20% in 1996 rose by only 10% by 2005, and those in the top 5% and top 1% actually declined. While it might seem as if both these radically different sets of statistics cannot be true at the same time, what makes them mutually compatible is that flesh-and-blood human beings move from one statistical category to another over time. When those taxpayers who were initially in the lowest income bracket had their incomes nearly double in a decade, that moved many of them up and out of the bottom quintile. And when those in the top 1% had their incomes cut by about 1/4, that may well have dropped them out of the top 1%. Internal Revenue Service data can follow particular individuals over time from their tax returns, which have individual Social Security numbers as identification, while data from the Census Bureau and most other sources follow what happens to statistical categories over time, even though it is not the same individuals in the same categories over the years. Many of the same kinds of data used to claim a widening income gap between the rich and the poor, names usually given to people with different incomes, rather than different wealth, as the terms rich and poor might seem to imply, have led many in the media to likewise claim a growing income gap between the super-rich and the merely rich. Under the headline, "Richest are leaving even the rich far behind," a front-page New York Times article dubbed the top 0.1% of income earners, the top 1,000th, as the hyper-rich, and declared that they have even left behind people making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. Once again, the confusion is between what is happening to statistical categories over time and what is happening to flesh-and-blood individuals over time, as they move from one statistical category to another. Despite the rise in the income of the top 0.1% of taxpayers as a statistical category, both absolutely and relative to the incomes in other categories, as flesh-and-blood human beings, those individuals who were in that category initially had their incomes actually fall by a whopping 50% between 1996 and 2005. It is hardly surprising if people whose incomes are cut in half drop out of the top 0.1%. What happens to the income of the category over time is not the same as what happens to the people who were in that category at any given point in time. But many among the intelligentsia are ready to seize upon any numbers that seem to fit their vision. Behind many of those numbers and the accompanying alarmist rhetoric is a very mundane fact. Most people begin their working careers at the bottom, earning entry-level salaries. Over time, as they acquire more skills and experience, their rising productivity leads to rising pay, putting them in successively higher income brackets. These are not rare Horatio Alger stories. These are common patterns among millions of people in the United States and in some other countries. More than 3/4 of those working Americans whose incomes were in the bottom 20% in 1975 were also in the top 40% of income earners at some point by 1991. Only 5% of those who were initially in the bottom quintile were still there in 1991, while 29% of those who were initially at the bottom quintile had risen to the top quintile. Yet verbal virtuosity has transformed a transient cohort in a given statistical category into an enduring class called the poor. Just as most Americans, in statistical categories identified as the poor, are not an enduring class there, studies in Britain, Canada, New Zealand, and Greece show similar patterns of transience among those in low-income brackets at a given time. Just over half of all Americans earning at or near the minimum wage are from 16 to 24 years of age, and, of course, these individuals cannot remain from 16 to 24 years of age indefinitely, though that age category can, of course, continue indefinitely, providing many intellectuals with data to fit their preconceptions. Only by focusing on the income brackets, instead of the actual people moving between those brackets, have the intelligentsia been able to verbally create a problem for which a solution is necessary. They have created a powerful vision of classes, with disparities and inequities in income, caused by barriers created by society. But the routine rise of millions of people out of the lowest quintile over time makes a mockery of the barriers assumed by many, if not most, of the intelligentsia. Far from using their intellectual skills to clarify the distinction between statistical categories and flesh-and-blood human beings, the intelligentsia have instead used their verbal virtuosity to equate the changing numerical relationship between statistical categories over time with a changing relationship between flesh-and-blood human beings, the rich and the poor, over time, even though data that follow individual income earners over time tell a diametrically opposite story from that of data which follow the statistical categories which people are moving into and out of over time. The confusion between statistical categories and flesh-and-blood human beings is compounded when there is confusion between income and wealth. People called rich or super-rich have been given these titles by the media on the basis of income, not wealth, even though being rich means having more wealth. According to the Treasury Department, among those with the very highest incomes in 1996, the top 1/100th of 1%, only 25% remained in this group in 2005. If these were genuinely super-rich people, it is hard to explain why 3/4 of them are no longer in that category a decade later. A related but somewhat different confusion between statistical categories and human beings has led to many claims in the media and in academia that Americans' incomes have stagnated or grown only very slowly over the years. For example, over the entire period from 1967 to 2005, median real household income, that is, money income adjusted for inflation, rose by 31%. For selected periods within that long span, real household incomes rose even less, and those selected periods have often been cited by the intelligentsia to claim that income and living standards have stagnated. Meanwhile, real per capita income rose by 122% over that same span, from 1967 to 2005. When a more than doubling of income is called stagnation, that is one of the many feats of verbal virtuosity. The reason for the large discrepancy between growth rate trends in household income and growth rate trends in individual income is very straightforward. The number of persons per household has been declining over the years. As of 1966, for example, the U.S. Bureau of the Census reported that the number of households was increasing faster than the number of people, and concluded the main reason for the more rapid rate of household formation is the increased tendency, particularly among unrelated individuals, to maintain their own homes or apartments rather than live with relatives or move into existing households as roomers, lodgers, and so forth. Increasing individual incomes made this possible. Despite such obvious and mundane facts, household or family income statistics continue to be widely cited in the media and in academia, and per capita income statistics widely ignored, despite the fact that households are variable in size, while per capita income always refers to the income of one person. However, the statistics that the intelligentsia keeps citing are much more consistent with their vision of America than the statistics they keep ignoring. Just as household statistics understate the rise in the American standard of living over time, they overstate the degree of income inequality, since lower-income households tend to have fewer people than upper-income households. While there are 39 million people in households whose incomes are in the bottom 20%, there are 64 million people in households whose incomes are in the top 20%. There is nothing mysterious about this either, given the number of low-income mothers living with fatherless children and low-income lodgers in single-room occupancy hotels or rooming houses, for example. Even if every person in the entire country received exactly the same income, there would still be a significant disparity between the average incomes received by households containing 64 million people compared to the average income received by households containing 39 million people. That disparity would be even greater if only the incomes of working adults were counted, even if those working adults all had identical incomes. There are more adult heads of household working full-time and year-round in even the top 5% of households than in the bottom 20% of households. Many income statistics are misleading in another sense when they leave out the income received in kind, such as food stamps and subsidized housing, which often exceeds the value of the cash income received by people in the lower income brackets. In 2001, for example, transfers in cash or in kind accounted for more than 3/4 of the total economic resources at the disposal of people in the bottom 20%. Moral considerations. The difference between statistical categories and actual people affects moral as well as empirical issues. However concerned we might be about the economic fate of flesh-and-blood human beings, that is very different from being alarmed or outraged about the fate of statistical categories. Michael Harrington's best-selling book, The Other America, for example, dramatized income statistics, lamenting the anguish of the poor in America, tens of millions maimed in body and spirit, constituting the shame of the other America, people caught in a vicious circle and suffering a warping of the will and spirit that is a consequence of being poor. But investing statistical data with moral angst does nothing to establish a connection between a transient cohort in statistical categories and an enduring class conjured up through verbal virtuosity. There was a time when such rhetoric might have made some sense in the United States, and there are other countries where it may still make sense today. But most of those Americans now living below the official poverty line have possessions once considered part of a middle-class standard of living, just a generation or so ago. As of 2001, 3/4 of Americans with incomes below the official poverty level had air conditioning, which only 1/3 of Americans had in 1971. 97% had color television, which fewer than half of Americans had in 1971. 73% owned a microwave oven, which fewer than 1% of Americans had in 1971, and 98% of the poor had either a videocassette recorder or a DVD player, which no one had in 1971. In addition, 72% of the poor owned a motor vehicle. None of this has done much to change the rhetoric of the intelligentsia, however much it may reflect changes in the standard of living of Americans in the lower income brackets. Typical of the mindset of many intellectuals was a book by Andrew Hacker, which referred to the trillions of dollars that become the personal income of Americans each year, and said, "Just how this money is apportioned will be the subject of this book." But this money is not apportioned at all. It becomes income through an entirely different process. The very phrase income distribution is tendentious. It starts the economic story in the middle, with a body of income or wealth existing somehow, leaving only the question as to how that income or wealth is to be distributed or apportioned, as Professor Hacker puts it. In the real world, the situation is quite different. In a market economy, most people receive income as a result of what they produce, supplying other people with some goods or services that those people want, even if that service is only labor. Each recipient of these goods and services pays according to the value which that particular recipient puts on what is received, choosing among alternate suppliers to find the best combination of price and quality. Both is judged by the individual who is paying. This mundane utilitarian process is quite different from the vision of income distribution projected by those among the intelligentsia who invest that vision with moral angst. If there really were some pre-existing body of income or wealth, produced somehow, manna from heaven, as it were, then there would, of course, be a moral question as to how large a share each member of society should receive. But wealth is produced. It does not just exist somehow. Where millions of individuals are paid according to how much what they produce is valued subjectively by millions of other individuals, it is not at all clear on what basis third parties could say that some goods or services are overvalued or undervalued, that cooking should be valued more or carpentry should be valued less, for example, much less that not working at all is not rewarded enough compared to working. Nor is there anything mysterious in the fact that at least 1,000 times as many people would pay to hear Pavarotti sing as would pay to hear the average person sing. Where people are paid for what they produce, One person's output can easily be worth 1,000 times as much as another person's output to those who are the recipients of that output, if only because thousands more people are interested in receiving some products or services than are interested in receiving other products and services, or even the same product or service from someone else. For example, when Tiger Woods left the golf tournament circuit for several months because of an injury, television audiences for the final round of major tournaments declined by varying amounts, ranging up to 61%. That can translate into millions of dollars worth of advertising revenue, based on the number of television viewers. The fact that one person's productivity may be 1,000 times as valuable as another's does not mean that one person's merit is 1,000 times as great as another's. Productivity and merit are very different things. An individual's productivity is affected by innumerable factors besides the efforts of that individual, being born with a great voice being an obvious example, being raised in a particular home with a particular set of values and behavior patterns, living in a particular geographic or social environment, merely being born with a normal brain, rather than a brain damaged during the birth process, can make enormous differences in what a given person is capable of producing. Moreover, third parties are in no position to second-guess the felt value of someone's productivity to someone else, and it is hard even to conceive how someone's merit could be judged accurately by another human being who never walked in his shoes. An individual raised in terrible home conditions or terrible social conditions may be laudable for having become an average, decent citizen with average work skills as a shoe repairer, while someone raised from birth with every advantage that money and social position can confer may be no more laudable for becoming an eminent brain surgeon. But that is wholly different from saying that repairing shoes is just as valuable to others as being able to repair maladies of the brain. To say that merit may be the same is not to say that productivity is the same. Nor can we logically or morally ignore the discrepancy in the relative urgency of those who want their shoes repaired versus those in need of brain surgery. In other words, it is not a question of simply weighing the interest of one income recipient versus the interest of another income recipient, while ignoring the vastly larger number of other people whose well-being depends on what these individuals produce. If one prefers an economy in which income is divorced from productivity, then the case for that kind of economy needs to be made explicitly. But that is wholly different from making such a large and fundamental change on the basis of verbal virtuosity in depicting the issue as being simply that of one set of income distribution statistics today versus an alternative set of income distribution statistics tomorrow. As for the moral question, whether any given set of human beings can be held responsible for disparities in other people's productivity and consequent earnings, depends on how much control any given set of human beings has maintained, or can possibly maintain, over the innumerable factors which have led to existing differences in productivity. Since no human being has control over the past, and many deeply ingrained cultural differences are a legacy of the past, limitations on what can be done in the present are limitations on what can be regarded as moral failings by society. Still less can statistical differences between groups be automatically attributed to barriers created by society. Barriers exist in the real world, just as cancer exists. But acknowledging that does not mean that all deaths, or even most deaths, can be automatically attributed to cancer, or that most economic differences can be automatically attributed to barriers. Within the constraints of circumstances, there are things which can be done to make opportunities more widely available, or to help those whose handicaps are too severe to expect them to utilize whatever opportunities are already available. In fact, much has already been done and is still being done in a country like the United States, which leads the world in philanthropy, not only in terms of money, but also in terms of individuals donating their time to philanthropic endeavors. But only by assuming that everything that has not been done could have been done, disregarding costs and risks, can individuals or societies be blamed because the real world does not match some vision of an ideal society. Nor can the discrepancy between the real and the vision of the ideal be automatically blamed on the existing reality, as if visionaries cannot possibly be mistaken. The poor as consumers. Although most people in the lower income brackets as of a given time do not remain there permanently, some people do. Moreover, particular neighborhoods may remain the homes of poor people for generations, no matter how many people from those neighborhoods move out to a better life as they move up from one income bracket to another. Complete racial turnovers in neighborhoods, Harlem having once been a middle-class Jewish community, are just one sign of such economic mobility. Low-income neighborhoods tend to have their own economic characteristics, one of the most salient of which is that prices tend to be higher there than in other neighborhoods. Intellectuals' discussions of the fact that the poor pay more are often indignant indictments and condemnations of those who charge higher prices to people who can least afford to pay them. The causes of those high prices are implicitly assumed to originate with those who charge them, and in particular to be due to malign dispositions such as greed, racism, and the like. Seldom is the possibility even mentioned, much less investigated, that whoever or whatever conveys high prices may not be the same as whoever or whatever causes those prices to be higher than in other neighborhoods. Confusing conveyance with causation is at the heart of many intellectuals' discussions of social problems. In many very different contexts, prices often convey an underlying reality without being the cause of that reality. Among the underlying realities in many low-income neighborhoods are higher rates of crime, vandalism, and violence, as well as a lack of the economic prerequisites for the economies of scale, which enable big chain stores to charge lower prices and make profits on higher rates of inventory turnover in more affluent neighborhoods. But such mundane considerations do not present intellectuals with either an opportunity to display their special kind of knowledge or an opportunity to display their presumptions of superior virtue by condemning others. If stores in low-income neighborhoods were in fact making higher rates of profit on their investments, it would be hard to explain why national store chains and many other businesses avoid locating in such places, which are often painfully lacking in many businesses that are common in more affluent neighborhoods. The underlying costs of providing financial services to people in low-income neighborhoods are likewise ignored by much, if not most, of the intelligentsia. Instead, the high rates of interest charged on personal loans to the poor are enough to set off orgies of denunciation and demands for government intervention to put an end to exploitative and unconscionable interest rates. Here, verbal virtuosity is often used by stating interest rates in annual percentage terms, when in fact loans made in low-income neighborhoods are often made for a matter of weeks or even days to meet some exigency of the moment. The sums of money lent are usually a few $100s, lent for a few weeks, with interest charges of about $15 per $100 lent. That works out to annual interest rates in the hundreds, the kind of statistics that produce sensations in the media and in politics. The costs behind such charges are seldom, if ever, investigated by the intelligentsia, by so-called consumer advocates, or by others in the business of creating sensations and denouncing businesses that they know little or nothing about. The economic consequences of government intervention to limit the annual interest rate can be seen in a number of states where such limits have been imposed. After Oregon imposed a limit of 36% annual interest, 3/4 of its payday loan businesses closed down. Nor is it hard to see why, if one bothers to look at facts. At a 36% limit on the annual interest rate, the $15 in interest charged for every $100 lent would be reduced to less than $1.50 for a loan payable in 2 weeks, an amount not likely to cover even the cost of processing the loan, much less the risks of making the loan. As for the low-income borrower, supposedly the reason for the concern of the moral elites, denying the borrower the $100 needed to meet some exigency must be weighed against the $15 paid to meet that exigency. Why that trade-off decision should be forcibly removed by law from the person most knowledgeable about the situation, as well as most affected by it, and transferred to third parties far removed in specific knowledge and general circumstances, is a question that is seldom answered or even asked. With intellectuals who consider themselves knowledgeable, as well as compassionate, it would seldom occur to them to regard themselves as interfering with things of which they are very ignorant, and doing so at costs imposed on people far less fortunate than themselves. A New York Times editorial, for example, denounced the payday loan providers' triple-digit annual interest rates milking people's desperation and profiteering with the cloak of capitalist virtue. It described a 36% interest rate ceiling as something needed to prevent the egregious exploitation of payday loans. How much good it may have done the New York Times to say such things tells us nothing about whether it did any good for the poor to have one of their already limited options taken off the table. Economic systems. The most fundamental fact of economics, without which there would be no economics, is that what everybody wants always adds up to more than there is. If this were not true, then we would be living in a Garden of Eden, where everything is available in unlimited abundance, instead of in an economy with limited resources and unlimited desires. Because of this inherent scarcity, regardless of whether a particular economic system is one of capitalism, socialism, feudalism, or whatever, An economy not only organizes production and the distribution of the resulting output, it must by its very nature also have ways to prevent people from completely satisfying their desires. That is, it must convey the inherent scarcity, without which there would be no real point to economics, even though the particular economy does not cause that scarcity. In a market economy, prices convey the inherent scarcity through competing bids for resources and outputs that are inherently inadequate to supply all the bidders with all that they want. This may seem like a small and obvious point, but even such renowned intellectuals as the philosopher John Dewey have grossly misconceived it, blaming the particular economic system that conveys scarcity for causing the scarcity itself. Dewey saw the existing market economy as one maintaining artificial scarcity for the sake of personal profit. George Bernard Shaw likewise saw restricting output as the principle on which capitalism was founded. Bertrand Russell depicted a market economy as one in which wealthy highwaymen are allowed to levy toll upon the world for the use of indispensable minerals. According to Dewey, to make potential abundance an actuality, what was needed was to modify institutions. But he apparently found it unnecessary to specify any alternative set of economic institutions in the real world, which had in fact produced greater abundance than the institutions he blamed for maintaining artificial scarcity. As in many other cases, the utter absence of factual evidence or even a single step of logic often passes unnoticed among the intelligentsia when someone is voicing a view common among their peers and consistent with their general vision of the world. Similarly, a 21st century historian said in passing, as something too obvious to require elaboration, that capitalism created masses of laborers who were poverty-stricken. There were certainly many such laborers in the early years of capitalism, but neither this historian nor most other intellectuals have bothered to show that capitalism created this poverty. If in fact those laborers were more prosperous before capitalism, then not only would such a fact need to be demonstrated, what would also need to be explained is why laborers gave up this earlier and presumably higher standard of living to go work for capitalists for less. Seldom is either of these tasks undertaken by intellectuals who make such assertions, and seldom do their fellow intellectuals challenge them to do so, when they are saying things that fit the prevailing vision. Chaos versus competition. Among the other unsubstantiated notions about economics common among the intelligentsia are that there would be chaos in the economy without government planning or control. The order created by a deliberately controlled process may be far easier to conceive or understand than an order emerging from an uncontrolled set of innumerable interactions. But that does not mean that the former is necessarily more common, more consequential, or more desirable in its consequences. Neither chaos nor randomness is implicit in uncontrolled circumstances. In a virgin forest, the flora and fauna are not distributed randomly or chaotically. Vegetation growing on a mountainside differs systematically at different heights. Certain trees grow more abundantly at lower elevations, and other kinds of trees at higher elevations. Above some altitude, no trees at all grow, and at the summit of Everest, no vegetation at all grows. Obviously, none of this is a result of any decisions made by the vegetation, but depends on variations in surrounding circumstances, such as temperature and soil. It is a systemically determined outcome with a pattern, not chaos. Animal life also varies with environmental differences, and while animals, like humans, and unlike vegetation, have thought and volition, that thought and volition are not always the decisive factors in the outcomes. That fish live in the water and birds in the air, rather than vice versa, is not strictly a matter of their choices, though each has choices of behavior within their respective environments. Moreover, what kinds of choices of behavior will survive the competition that weeds out some kinds of responses to the environment and lets others continue is likewise not wholly a matter of volition. In short, between individual volition and general outcomes are systemic factors which limit or determine what will survive, creating a pattern rather than chaos. None of this is difficult to understand in the natural environment, but the difference between individual volitional causation and constraining systemic causation is one seldom considered by intellectuals when discussing economies, unless they happen to be economists. Yet that distinction has been commonplace among economists for more than 2 centuries, nor has this been simply a matter of opinion or ideology. Systemic analysis was as common in Karl Marx as in Adam Smith, and it existed in the 18th century school of French economists called the Physiocrats, before either Marx or Smith wrote about economics. Even the analogy between systemic order in nature and in an economy was suggested by the title of one of the physiocratic writings of the 18th century, L'Ordre Naturel, by Mercier de la Rivière. It was the physiocrats who coined the phrase laissez-faire, later associated with Adam Smith, based on their conviction that an uncontrolled economy was not one of chaos, but of order, emerging from systemic interactions among the people competing with and accommodating to one another. Karl Marx, of course, had a less benign view of the pattern of outcomes of market competition than did the physiocrats or Adam Smith, but what is crucial here is that he too analyzed the market economy in terms of its systemic interactions, rather than its volitional choices, even when these were the choices of its economic elites, such as capitalists. Marx said that competition creates economic results that are wholly independent of the will of the capitalist. Thus, for example, while a new technology with lower production costs enables the capitalist to lower his prices, the spread of that technology to competing capitalists compels him to lower his prices, according to Marx. Likewise, in his analysis of downturns in the economy, depressions or economic crises in Marxian phraseology, Marx made a sharp distinction between systemic causation versus volitional causation. A man who has produced has not the choice whether he will sell or not. He must sell. And in crises appears precisely the circumstance that he cannot sell, or only below the price of production, or even that he must sell at a positive loss. What does it avail him, or us, therefore, that he has produced in order to sell? What concerns us is precisely to discover what has cut across this good intention of his. Neither in his theory of economics, nor in his theory of history, did Marx make end results simply the carrying out of individual volition, even the volition of elites. As his collaborator Friedrich Engels put it, what each individual wills is obstructed by everyone else, and what emerges is something that no one willed. Economics is about the pattern that emerges. Historian Charles A. Beard could seek to explain the Constitution of the United States by the economic interests of those who wrote it, but that volitional approach was not the approach used by Marx and Engels, despite how often Beard's theory of history has been confused with the Marxian theory of history. Marx dismissed a similar theory in his own day as facile anecdote-mongering and the attribution of all great events to petty and mean causes. The question here is not whether most intellectuals agree with systemic analysis, either in economics or elsewhere. Many have never even considered, much less confronted, that kind of analysis. Those who reason in terms of volitional causation see chaos from conflicting individual decisions as the alternative to central control of economic processes. John Dewey said, "Comprehensive plans are required if the problem of social organization is to be met. Otherwise, there will be a continuation of a regime of accident, waste, and distress." To Dewey, dependence upon intelligence is an alternative to drift and casual improvisation, that is, chaos, and those who are hostile to intentional social planning are in favor of atomistic individualism. Here, as in other cases, verbal virtuosity transforms the arguments of people with opposing views into mere emotions. In this case, the emotion is hostility to social planning. That hostility is presumably due to the leftover notions of a bygone era that society can depend on the unplanned coincidence of the consequences of a vast multitude of efforts put forth by isolated individuals without reference to any social end, according to Dewey's characterization of those with whom he disagreed. By the time John Dewey said all this, 1935, it was more than a century and a half since the French physiocrats first wrote their books explaining how competitive markets systemically coordinate economic activities and allocate resources through supply and demand adjustments to price movements. Whether or not one agrees with the physiocrats' explanations, or the similar and more sophisticated explanations of later economists, these are the arguments that would have to be answered if such arguments were not so widely evaded by reducing them to emotions, or by using other arguments without arguments. Professor Ronald Dworkin of Oxford, for example, simply dismissed arguments for systemic causation in general, whether in the economy or elsewhere, as the silly faith that ethics as well as economics moves by an invisible hand, so that individual rights and the general good will coalesce, and law, based on principle, will move the nation to a frictionless utopia where everyone is better off than he was before. Here again, verbal virtuosity transforms an opposing argument rather than answering it with either logic or evidence. Moreover, as of the time when Professor Dworkin made this claim, there were numerous examples of countries whose economies were primarily market economies, and others whose economies clearly were not, so that empirical comparisons were readily available, including comparisons of countries composed of the same peoples, East Germany versus West Germany, or North Korea versus South Korea, for example. But verbal virtuosity made both analytical and empirical arguments unnecessary. Economic competition is what forces innumerable disparate individual decisions to be reconciled with one another, as transactions terms are forced to change in response to changes in supply and demand, which in turn change economic activities. This is not a matter of faith, as Dworkin would have it, or of ideology, as Dewey would have it, but of economic literacy. John Dewey could depict businesses as controlling markets, but that position is not inherent in being ideologically on the left. Karl Marx was certainly on the left, but the difference was that he had studied economics as deeply as anyone of his time. Just as Karl Marx did not attribute what he saw as the detrimental effects of a market economy to individual capitalists, so Adam Smith did not attribute what he saw as the beneficial effects of a market economy to individual capitalists. Smith's depictions of businessmen were at least as negative as those of Marx, even though Smith is rightly regarded as the patron saint of free market economics. According to Smith, the beneficial social effects of the businessman's endeavors are no part of his intention. Both in Adam Smith's day and today, more than 2 centuries later, arguments for a free market economy are based on the systemic effects of such economies in allocating scarce resources which have alternative uses through competition in the marketplace. Whether one agrees or disagrees with the conclusions, this is the argument that must be confronted or evaded. Contrary to Dewey and many others, systemic arguments are independent of any notions of atomistic individualism. These are not arguments that each individual's well-being adds up to the well-being of society. Such an argument would ignore the systemic interactions which are at the heart of economic analysis, whether by Adam Smith, Karl Marx, or other economists. These economic arguments need not be elaborated here, since they are spelled out at length in economics textbooks. What is relevant here is that those intellectuals who see chaos as the alternative to government planning or control have seldom bothered to confront those arguments, and have instead misconceived the issue and distorted the arguments of those with different views. Despite the often expressed dichotomy between chaos and planning, what is called planning is the forcible suppression of millions of people's plans by a government-imposed plan. What is considered to be chaos are systemic interactions whose nature, logic, and consequences are seldom examined by those who simply assume that planning by surrogate decision-makers must be better. Herbert Croly, the first editor of the New Republic and a major figure in the Progressive Era, characterized Thomas Jefferson's conception of limited government as the old fatal policy of drift, as contrasted with Alexander Hamilton's policy of energetic and intelligent assertion of the national good. According to Croly, what was needed was an energetic and clear-sighted central government. In this conception, progress depends on surrogate decision-makers, rather than on millions of others making their own decisions and exerting their own efforts. Despite the notion that scarcity is contrived for the sake of profit in a market economy, that scarcity is at the heart of any economy, capitalist, socialist, feudal, or whatever. Given that this scarcity is inherent in the system as a whole, any system, that scarcity must be conveyed to each individual in some way. In other words, it makes no sense for any economy to produce as much as physically possible of any given product, because that would have to be done with scarce resources which could be used to produce other products, whose supply is also inherently limited to less than what people want. Markets in capitalist economies reconcile these competing demands for the same resources through price movements in both the markets for consumer goods and the market for the resources which go into producing those consumer goods. These prices make it unprofitable for one producer to use a resource beyond the point where that resource has a greater value to some competing producer who is bidding for that same resource. For the individual manufacturer, the point at which it would no longer be profitable to use more of some factor of production, land, labor, machinery, etc., is indeed the point which provides the limit of that manufacturer's output, even when it would be physically possible to produce more. But while profitability and unprofitability convey that limit, they are not what cause that limit, which is due to the scarcity of resources inherent in any economic system, whether or not it is a profit-based system. Producing more of a given output in disregard of those limits does not make an economy more prosperous. On the contrary, it means producing an excess of one output at the cost of a shortage of another output that could have been produced with the same resources. This was a painfully common situation in the government-run economy of the Soviet Union, where unsold goods often piled up in warehouses, while dire shortages had people waiting in long lines for other goods. Ironically, Marx and Engels had foreseen the economic consequences of fiat prices created by government, rather than by supply and demand, long before the founding of the Soviet Union, even though the Soviets claimed to be following Marxian principles. When publishing a later edition of Marx's 1847 book, The Poverty of Philosophy, in which Marx rejected fiat pricing, Engels spelled out the problems in his editor's introduction. He pointed out that price fluctuations have forcibly brought home to the individual commodity producers what things and what quantity of them society requires or does not require. Without such a mechanism, he demanded to know what guarantee we have that necessary quantity and not more of each product will be produced, that we shall not go hungry in regard to corn and meat while we are choked in beet sugar and drowned in potato spirit, that we shall not lack trousers to cover our nakedness while trouser buttons flood us in millions. On this point, the difference between Marx and Engels on the one hand and most other intellectuals of the left on the other was simply that Marx and Engels had studied economics, and the others usually had not. A volitional view of economics enables the intelligentsia, like politicians and others, to dramatize economics, explaining high prices by greed and low wages by a lack of compassion, for example. While this is part of an ideological vision, an ideology of the left is not sufficient by itself to explain this approach. I paint the capitalist and the landlord in no sense couleur de rose, Karl Marx said in the introduction of the first volume of Capital. My standpoint, he added, however, can less than any other make the individual responsible for relations whose creature he socially remains, however much he may subjectively raise himself above them. In short, prices and wages were not determined volitionally, but systemically. Understanding that was not a question of being on the left or not, but of being economically literate or illiterate. The underlying notion of volitional pricing has, in our own times, led to at least a dozen federal investigations of American oil companies over the years, in response to either gasoline shortages or increases in gasoline prices, with none of these investigations turning up facts to support the sinister explanations abounding in the media and in politics when these investigations were launched. Many people find it hard to believe that negative economic events are not a result of villainy, even though they accept positive economic events, the declining prices of computers that are far better than earlier computers, for example, as being just a result of progress that happens somehow. In a market economy, prices convey an underlying reality about supply and demand, and about production costs behind supply, as well as innumerable individual preferences and trade-offs behind demand. By regarding prices as merely arbitrary social constructs, some can imagine that existing prices can be replaced by prices controlled by government, reflecting wiser and nobler notions, such as affordable housing or reasonable health care costs. A history of price controls going back for centuries in countries around the world shows negative and even disastrous consequences from treating prices as mere arbitrary constructs, rather than as symptoms and conveyances of an underlying reality that is not nearly as susceptible to control as the prices are. As far as many, if not most, intellectuals are concerned, history would show that, but does not, because they often see no need to consult history or any other validation process beyond the peer consensus of other similarly disposed intellectuals when discussing economic issues. The crucial distinction between market transactions and collective decision-making is that in the market, people are rewarded according to the value of their goods and services to those particular individuals who receive those goods and services, and who have every incentive to seek alternative sources so as to minimize their costs, just as sellers of goods and services have every incentive to seek the highest bids for what they have to offer. But collective decision-making by third parties allows those third parties to superimpose their preferences on others at no cost to themselves, and to become the arbiters of other people's economic fate without accountability for the consequences. Government intervention. Among the consequences of the economic illiteracy of most intellectuals is the zero-sum vision of the economy mentioned earlier, in which the gains of one individual or one group represent a corresponding loss to another individual or another group. According to Harold Laski, the interests of capital and labor are irreconcilable in fundamentals. There's a sum to divide, and each wants more than the other will give. This assumption is seldom spelled out this plainly, perhaps not even in the minds of most of those whose conclusions require such an implicit zero-sum assumption as a foundation, but the widespread notion, coalescing into a doctrine, that one must take sides in making public policy, or even in rendering judicial decisions, ignores the fact that economic transactions would not continue to take place unless both sides find these transactions preferable to not making such transactions. Each side would of course prefer to have the terms favor themselves more, but both sides must be willing to accept some mutually agreeable terms, or no such transaction will take place at all, much less continue. Far from being an irreconcilable situation, as Lasky claimed, it is a situation reconciled millions of times each day. Otherwise, the economy could not function. Indeed, a whole society could not function without vast numbers of both economic and non-economic decisions to cooperate, despite the fact that no two sets of interests, even among members of the same family, are exactly the same. Contrary to Lasky and many others with similar views, there is no given sum to divide, as there would be with manna from heaven. It is precisely the cooperation of capital and labor which creates a wealth that would not exist otherwise, and that both sides would forfeit if they did not reconcile their conflicting desires at the outset, in order to produce it. It is literally preposterous, putting in front what comes behind, to begin the analysis with a sum to divide, that is, wealth, when that wealth can be created only after capital and labor have reconciled their competing claims and agreed to terms on which they can operate together in the production of wealth. The habit of many intellectuals to largely ignore the prerequisites, incentives, and constraints involved in the production of wealth has many ramifications that can lead to many fallacious conclusions, even if their verbal virtuosity conceals these fallacies from others, and even from themselves. Intervention by politicians, judges, or others, in order to impose terms more favorable to one side, minimum wage laws or rent control, for example, reduces the overlapping set of mutually agreeable terms and, almost invariably, reduces the number of mutually acceptable transactions, as the party disfavored by the intervention makes fewer transactions subsequently. Countries with generous minimum wage laws, for example, often have higher unemployment rates and longer periods of unemployment than other countries, as employers offer fewer jobs to inexperienced and low-skilled workers, who are typically the least valued and lowest paid, and who are most often priced out of a job by minimum wage laws. It is not uncommon in European countries with generous minimum wage laws, as well as other worker benefits that employers are mandated to pay for, to have inexperienced younger workers with unemployment rates of 20% or more. Employers are made slightly worse off by having to rearrange their businesses and perhaps pay for more machinery to replace the low-skilled workers whom it is no longer economic to hire. But those low-skilled, usually younger workers may be made much worse off by not being able to get jobs as readily, losing both the wages they could make otherwise and sustaining the perhaps greater loss of not acquiring the work experience that would lead to better jobs and higher pay. In short, taking sides often ends up making both sides worse off, even if in different ways and to different degrees. But the very idea of taking sides is based on treating economic transactions as if they were zero-sum events. This zero-sum vision of the world is also consistent with the disinterest of many intellectuals in what promotes or impedes the creation of wealth, on which the standard of living of a whole society depends, even though the creation of wealth has lifted the poor in the United States today to economic levels not reached by most of the American population in past eras, or in many other countries even today. Just as minimum wage laws tend to reduce employment transactions with those whose pay is most affected, increasing their unemployment, so rent control laws have been followed by housing shortages in Cairo, Melbourne, Hanoi, Paris, New York, and numerous other places around the world. Here again, attempts to make transactions terms better for one party usually lead the other party to make fewer transactions. Builders especially react to rent control laws by building fewer apartment buildings, and in some places, building none at all for years on end. Landlords may continue to rent existing apartments, but often they cut back on ancillary services, such as painting, repairs, heat, and hot water, all of which cost money, and all of which are less necessary to maintain at previous levels needed to attract and keep tenants, once there is a housing shortage. The net result is that apartment buildings that receive less maintenance deteriorate faster and wear out, without adequate numbers of replacements being built. In Cairo, for example, this process led to families having to double up in quarters designed for only one family. The ultimate irony is that such laws can also lead to higher rents on average, New York and San Francisco being classic examples, when luxury housing is exempt from rent control, causing resources to be diverted to building precisely that kind of housing. The net result is that renters, landlords, and builders can all end up worse off than before, though in different ways and to different degrees. Landlords seldom end up living in crowded quarters or on the street, and builders can simply devote more of their time and resources to building other structures, such as warehouses, shopping malls, and office buildings, as well as luxury housing, all of which are usually not subject to rent control laws. But again, the crucial point is that both sides can end up worse off as a result of laws and policies based on taking sides, as if economic transactions were zero-sum processes. One of the few writers who has explicitly proclaimed the zero-sum vision of the economy, Professor Lester C. Thurow of MIT, author of The Zero-Sum Society, has also stated that the United States has been consistently the industrial economy with the worst record on unemployment. He spelled it out. Lack of jobs has been endemic in peacetime during the past 50 years of American history. Review the evidence: a depression from 1929 to 1940, a war from 1941 to 1945, a recession in 1949, a war from 1950 to 1953, recessions in 1954, 1957 and 58, and 1960 and 61, a war from 1965 to 1973, a recession in 1969-1970, a severe recession in 1974 and 75, and another recession probable in 1980. This is hardly an enviable economic performance. Several things are remarkable about Professor Thurow's statement. He reaches sweeping conclusions about the record of the United States vis-à-vis the record of other industrial nations, based solely on a recitation of events within the United States, a one-nation international comparison when it comes to facts, rather than rhetoric. Studies which in fact compare the unemployment rate in the United States versus Western European nations, for example, almost invariably show Western European nations with higher unemployment rates and longer periods of unemployment than the United States. Moreover, the wars that Professor Thurow throws in what is supposed to be a discussion of unemployment, might leave the impression that wars contribute to unemployment, when in fact unemployment virtually disappeared in the United States during World War II, and has been lower than usual during the other wars mentioned. Professor Thurow's prediction about a recession in 1980 turned out to be true, though that was hardly a daring prediction in the wake of the stagflation of the late 1970s. What turned out to be false was the idea that large-scale government intervention was required to head off more unemployment, that, in Thurow's words, the government needed to restructure the economy so that it will in fact provide jobs for everyone. What actually happened was that the Reagan administration took office in 1981 and did the exact opposite of what Lester Thurow advocated, and after the recession passed, there were 20 years of economic growth, low unemployment, and low inflation. Professor Thurow was not, and is not, some fringe kook. According to the material on the cover of the 2001 reprint of his 1980 book, The Zero-Sum Society, Lester Thurow has been professor of management and economics at MIT for more than 30 years. He is also the author of several books, including 3 New York Times bestsellers. He has served on the editorial board of the New York Times, as a contributing editor of Newsweek, and as a member of Time Magazine's Board of Economics. He could not be more mainstream, or more wrong, but what he said apparently found resonance among the elite intelligentsia, who made him an influence on major media outlets. Similar prescriptions for active government intervention in the economy have abounded among intellectuals past and present. John Dewey, for example, used such attractive phrases as socially organized intelligence in the conduct of public affairs and organized social reconstruction as euphemisms for the plain fact that third-party surrogate decision-makers seek to have their preferences imposed on millions of other people through the power of government. Although government is often called society by those who advocate this approach, there is no concrete institution called society, and what is called social planning are in fact government orders overriding the plans and mutual accommodations of millions of other people. Despite whatever vision may be conjured up by euphemisms, government is not some abstract embodiment of public opinion or Rousseau's general will. Government consists of politicians, bureaucrats, and judges, all of whom have their own incentives and constraints, and none of whom can be presumed to be any less interested in the promotion of their own interests or notions than are people who buy and sell in the marketplace. Neither sainthood nor infallibility is common in either venue. The fundamental difference between decision-makers in the market and decision-makers in government is that the former are subject to continuous and consequential feedback, which can force them to adjust to what others prefer and are willing to pay for, while those who make decisions in the political arena face no such inescapable feedback to force them to adjust to the reality of other people's desires and preferences. A business with red ink on the bottom line knows that this cannot continue indefinitely, and that they have no choice but to change whatever they are doing that produces that red ink, for which there is little tolerance even in the short run, and which will be fatal to the whole enterprise in the long run. In short, financial losses are not merely informational feedback, but consequential feedback, which cannot be ignored, dismissed, or spun rhetorically through verbal virtuosity. In the political arena, however, only the most immediate and most attention-getting disasters, so obvious and unmistakable to the voting public that there is no problem of connecting the dots, are comparably consequential for political decision-makers. But laws and policies whose consequences take time to unfold are by no means as consequential for those who created those laws and policies, especially if the consequences emerge after the next election. Moreover, there are few things in politics as unmistakable in its implications as red ink on the bottom line is in business. In politics, no matter how disastrous a policy may turn out to be, if the causes of the disaster are not understood by the voting public, those officials responsible for the disaster may escape any accountability, and of course they have every incentive to deny having made mistakes, since admitting mistakes can jeopardize a whole career. Why the transfer of economic decisions from the individuals and organizations directly involved, often depicted collectively and impersonally as the market, to third parties who pay no price for being wrong, should be expected to produce better results for society at large is a question seldom asked, much less answered. Partly this is because of rhetorical packaging by those with verbal virtuosity. To say, as John Dewey did, that there must be social control of economic forces sounds good in a vague sort of way, until that is translated into specifics as the holders of political power forbidding voluntary transactions among the citizenry. Business. The organizations, large and small, which produce and distribute most of the goods and services that make up a modern standard of living, businesses, have long been targets of the intelligentsia. Accusations against businesses have been as specific as charging excessively high prices and as nebulous as failing to live up to their social responsibilities. Management. Intellectuals who have never run any business have been remarkably confident that they know when businesses have been run wrongly, or when their owners or managers are overpaid. John Dewey, for example, declared, "Industrial entrepreneurs have reaped out of all proportion to what they sowed." Evidence? None. This is one of many assertions that can pass unchallenged among the intelligentsia, its familiarity and its consonance with the prevailing vision being substitutes for evidence or analysis. The ease of running a business has been a common belief going back at least as far as Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward in the 19th century. Lenin said that running a business involved extraordinarily simple operations which any literate person can perform, so that those in charge of such enterprises need not be paid more than any ordinary worker. Just 3 years after taking power, however, and with his post-capitalist economy facing what Lenin himself later called ruin, starvation, and devastation, he reversed himself and declared to the 1920 Communist Party Congress, "Opinions on corporate management are all too frequently imbued with a spirit of sheer ignorance, an anti-expert spirit." Lenin reversed himself in deeds as well as words, creating his new economic policy, which allowed more leeway for markets to function, and the Soviet economy began to recover. In short, the first time that the theory of how easy it is to run a business was put to a test, it failed that test disastrously. As the 20th century unfolded, that theory would fail repeatedly in other countries around the world, to the point where even most communist and socialist governments began to free up markets by the end of the 20th century, usually leading to higher economic growth rates, as in China and India. When judging those who run businesses, the criteria applied, either implicitly or explicitly, by many intellectuals, are often remote from any relevance to the operation of an economic enterprise. Theodore Roosevelt, for example, said, "It tires me to talk to rich men. You expect a man of millions, the head of a great industry, to be a man worth hearing, but as a rule, they don't know anything outside their own businesses." That certainly could not be said of Theodore Roosevelt himself. In addition to his experience as a politician at municipal, state, national, and international levels, T.R. was not only a well-educated and widely read man, but also a scholar in his own right, whose naval history of the War of 1812 was required reading at naval academies on both sides of the Atlantic for decades. The author of 15 books, he was for many years an intellectual in our sense, as someone who earned his living from his writings, especially during the years when his pay as a municipal or state official was inadequate to support his family, and during the years when his business ventures on the western frontier were losing money. Few, if any, Americans could match the breadth of his intellect, according to a biographer of Theodore Roosevelt. Certainly few, if any, business leaders were at all comparable to T.R. in intellectual scope or depth. Nor was there any reason why they should be. In many fields, it is often the specialist, sometimes the monomaniac, who is most likely to produce the peak achievements. No one expected Babe Ruth or Bobby Fischer to be a Renaissance man, and anyone who might have would have been very badly disappointed. The judging of people in non-intellectual fields by intellectual criteria will almost inevitably find them unworthy of the rewards they receive, which would be a legitimate conclusion only if non-intellectual endeavors were automatically less worthy than intellectual endeavors. Few would argue explicitly for this premise, but, as John Maynard Keynes pointed out, conclusions often continue on without the premises on which they were based. Another common misconception among the intelligentsia is that individual business entrepreneurs should, or could, be socially responsible by taking into account the wider consequences of the entrepreneur's business decisions. This idea goes back at least as far as Woodrow Wilson, another intellectual in our sense, because of his academic career before entering politics. We are not afraid of those who pursue legitimate pursuits, provided they link those pursuits in at every turn with the interest of the community as a whole, and no man can conduct a legitimate business if he conducts it in the interest of a single class. In other words, it is not considered sufficient if a manufacturer of plumbing fixtures produces high-quality faucets, pipes, and bathtubs and sells them at affordable prices, if this entrepreneur does not also take on the role of philosopher king and try to decide how this business affects the interest of the community, however that nebulous notion might be conceived. It is a staggering requirement which few, if any, people in business, academia, politics, or other occupations could meet. John Dewey likewise lamented that workers, like their employers, had no social outlook upon the consequences and meaning of what they are doing. Intellectuals may choose to imagine what are the wider social consequences of their own actions, inside or outside their fields of professional competence, but there is little or no consequential feedback when they are wrong, no matter how wrong or for how long. That both business owners and workers usually avoid taking on such a cosmic task suggests that they may have a more realistic assessment of human limitations. Business power, or control. One of the many signs of verbal virtuosity among intellectuals is the repackaging of words to mean things that are not only different from, but sometimes the direct opposite of, their original meanings. Freedom and power are among the most common of these repackaged words. The basic concept of freedom as not being subjected to other people's restrictions, and of power as the ability to restrict other people's options, have both been stood on their heads in some of the repackaging of these words by intellectuals discussing economic issues. Thus, business enterprises which expand the public's options, either quantitatively, through lower prices, or qualitatively, through better products, are often spoke of as controlling the market, whenever this results in a high percentage of consumers choosing to purchase their particular products rather than the competing products of other enterprises. In other words, when consumers decide that particular brands of products are either cheaper or better than competing brands of those products, third parties take it upon themselves to depict those who produced these particular brands as having exercised power or control. If, at a given time, 3/4 of the consumers prefer to buy the Acme brand of widgets to any other brand, then Acme Inc. will be said to control 3/4 of the market, even though consumers control 100% of the market, since they can switch to another brand of widgets tomorrow if someone else comes up with a better widget, or stop buying widgets altogether if a new product comes along that makes widgets obsolete. Any number of companies that have been said to control a majority of their market have not only lost that market share, but have gone bankrupt within a few years of their supposed dominance of the market. Smith Corona, for example, sold over half the typewriters and word processors in the United States in 1989, but just 6 years later, it filed for bankruptcy, as the spread of personal computers displaced both typewriters and word processors. Yet the verbal packaging of sales statistics ex post as market control ex ante has been common, not only in the writings of the intelligentsia, but even in courts of law and antitrust cases. Even at its peak, Smith Corona controlled nothing. Every consumer was free to buy any other brand of typewriter or word processor, or refrain from buying any. The verbal packaging of consumer choice as business control has become so widespread that few people seem to feel the need to do anything so basic as thinking about the meaning of the words they are using, which transform an ex post statistic into an ex ante condition. By saying that businesses have power because they have control of their markets, this verbal virtuosity opens the way to saying that government needs to exercise its countervailing power, John Kenneth Galbraith's phrase, in order to protect the public. Despite the verbal parallels, government power is, in fact, power, since individuals do not have a free choice as to whether or not to obey government laws and regulations, while consumers are free to ignore the products marketed by even the biggest and supposedly most powerful corporations in the world. There are people who have never set foot in a Walmart store, and there is nothing that Walmart can do about it, despite being the world's largest retailer. One of John Kenneth Galbraith's earliest and most influential books, American Capitalism, The Concept of Countervailing Power, declared that power on one side of a market creates both the need for and the prospect of reward to the exercise of countervailing power from the other side. Thus, according to Professor Galbraith, the rise of big corporations gave them an oppressive power over their employees, which led to the creation of labor unions in self-defense. As a matter of historical fact, however, it was not in large mass-production industries that American labor unions began, but in industries with numerous smaller businesses, such as construction, trucking, and coal mining, all of which were unionized years before the steel or automobile industries. But whatever the genesis of union power, the crucial countervailing power for Galbraith was that of the government, both in support of private countervailing power with such legislation as the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, and legislation to help coal producers and others supposedly oppressed by the power of big business. Such government countervailing power performs a valuable, indeed an indispensable regulatory function in the modern economy, according to Galbraith. But this formulation depends crucially on redefining power to include its opposite, the expansion of consumer options by businesses in order to increase sales. John Kenneth Galbraith was perhaps the most prominent, and certainly one of the most verbally gifted, of the advocates of a theory of volitional pricing. According to Professor Galbraith, the output of a given industry tends to become more concentrated over time in the hands of a few producers, who acquire decisive advantages that make it difficult for a new company without the same amount of experience to enter the industry and compete effectively against the leading incumbents. Therefore, according to Galbraith, sellers have gained authority over prices, which are tacitly administered by a few large firms. In reality, one of the most common reasons for buyers buying disproportionately from a particular seller is that this seller has a lower price. After Galbraith has redefined power as a concentration of sales and of resulting profits and size, he is able to depict that power of the seller as a reason why that seller can now set prices different from, and implicitly higher than, those of a competitive market. In this formulation, the size of the corporation which the individual heads is again a rough index of the power the individual exercises. However plausible all this might seem, Galbraith did not venture very far in the direction of empirical verification. The insinuation of Galbraith's, and many others, discussions of the power of big business is that the growth of ever larger businesses means the growth of their power to raise prices. This insinuation, as distinguished from either a demonstrated fact or even a testable hypothesis, was a staple among the intelligentsia long before Galbraith's time, and provided the impetus for the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, among other attempts to contain the power of big business. In reality, the era leading up to the Sherman Act was not an era of rising prices imposed by monopolies, even though it was an era of growing sizes of businesses in many industries, often through consolidation of smaller businesses into giant corporations. Far from leading to higher prices, however, this was an era of falling prices charged by these larger businesses, whose size created economies of scale, which meant lower production costs that enabled them to profit from lower prices, thereby expanding their sales. Crude oil, which sold for $12 to $16 a barrel in 1860, sold for less than $1 a barrel in every year from 1879 to 1900. Railroad freight costs fell by 1887 to 54% of what they had been in 1873. The price of steel rails fell from $68 in 1880 to $32 in 1890. The prices of sugar, lead, and zinc all fell during this period. Henry Ford pioneered in mass production methods and had some of the highest-paid workers of his day, decades before the industry was unionized, and the lowest-priced cars, notably the legendary Model T, which made the automobile no longer a luxury confined to the wealthy. But none of these plain facts prevailed against the vision of the progressive-era intelligentsia, who in this case included President Theodore Roosevelt. His administration launched antitrust prosecutions against some of the biggest price-cutters, including Standard Oil and the Great Northern Railroad. Theodore Roosevelt sought the power, in his words, to control and regulate all big combinations. He declared that, of all forms of tyranny, the least attractive and the most vulgar is the tyranny of mere wealth, the tyranny of a plutocracy. No doubt it was true, as T.R. said, that Standard Oil created enormous fortunes for its owners at the expense of business rivals, but it is questionable whether consumers who paid lower prices for oil felt that they were victims of a tyranny. One of the popular muckraking books of the progressive era was The History of the Standard Oil Company by Ida Tarbell, which said, among other things, that Rockefeller should have been satisfied with what he had achieved financially by 1870, implying greed in his continued efforts to increase the size and profitability of Standard Oil. A study done a century later, however, pointed out, one might never know from reading the history of Standard Oil that oil prices were actually falling. That fact had been filtered out of the story. The question whether Rockefeller's pursuit of a larger fortune actually made the consuming public worse off was seldom even addressed. How consumers would have been better off if a man who introduced extraordinary efficiencies into the production and distribution of oil had ended his career earlier, leaving both the cost of producing oil and the resulting prices higher, is a question not raised, much less answered. One of the common complaints against Standard Oil was that it was able to get railroads to charge them less for shipping their oil than was charged to competing businesses shipping oil. Such an inequality was of course anathema to those who thought in terms of abstract people in an abstract world, ignoring what there was specifically about Standard Oil that was different, which was the very reason why John D. Rockefeller amassed a fortune in an industry in which many others went bankrupt. Standard Oil's tank cars were easier to transport than oil shipped in barrels by other companies. Yet Theodore Roosevelt, who knew little or no economics and had lost a large portion of his inheritance in his one business venture, said that discount shipping rates were discriminatory and should be forbidden in every shape and form. Senator John Sherman, author of the Sherman Antitrust Act, also introduced legislation to ban differential shipping rates, apparently at the prompting of a refinery that shipped its oil in barrels. Businesses which charge lower prices often lead to losses by competing businesses which charge higher prices. But obvious as this might seem, it has not stopped outcries over the years from the intelligentsia, legislation from politicians, and adverse court decisions from judges, aimed not only at Standard Oil in the early 20th century, but also later at other businesses that reduced prices in other industries, ranging from the A&P grocery chain in the past to Microsoft today. In short, the verbal transformation of lower prices and larger sales into an exercise of power by business that has to be counteracted by more government power has more than purely intellectual implications. It has led to many laws, policies, and court decisions that punish lower prices in the name of protecting consumers. As a result of the spread of globalization, even if a particular company is the only producer of a given product in a given country, that monopoly means little if foreign producers of the same product compete in supplying that product to the consumers. Eastman Kodak has long been the only major American producer of film, but camera stores across the United States also sell film produced in Japan, Fuji, and sometimes in England, Ilford, and in other countries, quite aside from the competition from digital cameras, produced primarily overseas. In short, Kodak's ability to jack up film prices without suffering lost sales is hemmed in by substitutes. The fact that Eastman Kodak is a huge enterprise does not change any of that, except in the visions and rhetoric of the intelligentsia. The straining of words to depict businesses as exercising power in situations where consumers simply buy more of their products has been used to justify depriving people who run businesses of the rights exercised by other people. As we shall see in Chapter 6, this attitude can even extend to putting the burden of proof on businesses to rebut accusations in certain antitrust cases and civil rights cases. A somewhat similar mindset was expressed in a question asked in The Economist magazine. Why should companies be allowed to dodge taxes and sack workers by shifting operations overseas? In free countries, no one else's right to relocate for their own benefit is treated as something requiring some special justification. Indeed, workers who relocate to other countries in violation of immigration laws are often defended by those who consider it wrong for businesses to relocate legally. Recessions and depressions. Nothing established the idea that government intervention in the economy is essential, like the Great Depression of the 1930s. The raw facts tell the story of that historic tragedy. National output fell by 1/3 between 1929 and 1933. Thousands of banks failed. Unemployment peaked at 25%. Corporations as a whole lost money 2 years in a row. Prior to this time, no president had attempted to have the federal government intervene to bring a depression to an end. Many saw in the Great Depression the failure of free market capitalism as an economic system, and a reason for seeking a radically different kind of economy. For some, communism, for some, fascism, and for some, the New Deal policies of Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration. Whatever the particular alternative favored by particular individuals, what was widely believed then and later was that the stock market crash of 1929 was a failure of the free market and the cause of the massive unemployment that persisted for years during the 1930s. Given the two most striking features of that era, the stock market crash and a widespread government intervention in the economy, it is not immediately obvious which was more responsible for the dire economic conditions. But remarkably little effort has been made by most of the intelligentsia to try to sort out the cause or causes. It has been largely a foregone conclusion that the market was the cause and government intervention was the saving grace. While unemployment went up in the wake of the stock market crash, it never went as high as 10% for any month during the 12 months following that crash in October 1929. But the unemployment rate in the wake of subsequent government interventions in the economy never fell below 20% for any month over a period of 35 consecutive months. In short, though the stock market crash has been conceived of as the problem and government intervention as the solution, in reality, the unemployment rate following the economic problem was less than half of the unemployment rate following the political solution. One of the few things on which people across the ideological spectrum are agreed upon today is that the Federal Reserve System mishandled its job during the Great Depression. Looking back at that period, Milton Friedman called the people who ran the Federal Reserve inept, and John Kenneth Galbraith said that Federal Reserve officials showed startling incompetence. For example, as the country's money supply declined by 1/3 in the wake of massive bank failures, the Federal Reserve raised the interest rate, creating further deflationary pressures. In order to try to save American jobs by limiting imports that competed with American-made goods, Congress in 1930 passed the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, the highest in more than a century, despite a public appeal signed by more than 1,000 economists and a warning from them as to the consequences. Other nations retaliated, as the economists had warned, drastically reducing American exports and the jobs dependent on those exports, so that the unemployment rate went up rather than down. In the wake of these tariffs, unemployment rose far more dramatically than in the wake of the stock market crash. The unemployment rate stood at 6.3% in June 1930, 8 months after the stock market crash, when the Smoot-Hawley tariffs were passed. A year later, the unemployment rate was 15%, and a year after that it was 25.8%. All of this unemployment need not be attributed to the tariffs, but the point is that the tariffs were supposed to reduce unemployment. The unemployment rate was already trending generally downward for several months when the Smoot-Hawley bill was passed, a trend that reversed itself just 5 months after the new tariffs went into effect. Once the unemployment rate rose into double digits in November 1930, an unemployment rate as low as 6.3% was not seen again for the remainder of the decade. The Smoot-Hawley tariffs under Herbert Hoover were simply one of the first massive government interventions of the 1930s, including many more under Franklin D. Roosevelt. There is little empirical evidence to suggest that these interventions helped the economy, and much evidence to suggest that they made matters worse. Congress also passed laws more than doubling the tax rates on the upper income brackets under Hoover, and raised them still higher under FDR. President Hoover urged business leaders not to reduce workers' wage rates during the Depression, even though the greatly reduced money supply made the previous wage rates unpayable with full employment. Both Hoover and his successor, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, sought to keep prices from falling, whether the price of labor or of farm produce, assuming that this would keep purchasing power from falling. However, purchasing power depends not only on what prices are charged, but on how many transactions will actually be made at those prices. With a reduced money supply, neither the previous amount of employment of labor nor the previous sales of farm or industrial products could continue at the old prices. Neither Hoover nor FDR seemed to understand this, nor to have thought this far. However, columnist Walter Lippmann pointed out the obvious in 1934 when he said, "In a depression, men cannot sell their goods or their service at pre-depression prices. If they insist on pre-depression prices for goods, they do not sell them. If they insist on pre-depression wages, they become unemployed." In short, many things that the Federal Reserve, Congress, and the two presidents did were counterproductive. Given these multiple failures of government policy, it is by no means clear that it was the market economy which failed. There is, of course, no way to rerun the stock market crash of 1929 and have the federal government let the market adjust on its own to see how that experiment would turn out. The closest thing to such an experiment was the 1987 stock market crash, similar in size but not in duration to the 1929 collapse. The Reagan administration did nothing, despite outrage in the media at the government's failure to act. "What will it take to wake up the White House?" the New York Times asked, declaring that the president abdicates leadership and courts disaster. Washington Post columnist Mary McGrory said that Reagan has been singularly indifferent to the country's current pain and confusion. The Financial Times of London said that President Reagan appears to lack the capacity to handle adversity, and nobody seems to be in charge. A former official of the Carter administration criticized President Reagan's silence and inaction following the 1987 stock market crash, and compared him unfavorably to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, whose personal style and bold commands would be a tonic in the current crisis. The irony in this was that FDR presided over an economy with 7 consecutive years of double-digit unemployment, while Reagan's policy of letting the market recover on its own, far from leading to another Great Depression, led instead to one of the country's longest periods of sustained economic growth, low unemployment, and low inflation, lasting 20 years. Like many other facts at variance with the prevailing vision, this one received remarkably little attention at the time or since. While it might be possible to debate the wisdom or effectiveness of various government responses or non-responses to economic crises, there is remarkably little awareness of anything to debate by intellectuals outside the economics profession. Histories of the Great Depression by leading historians such as Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr. and Henry Steele Commager have made FDR the hero who came to the rescue, though Schlesinger himself admitted that he, Schlesinger, was not much interested in economics, despite his willingness to make historic assessments of how FDR's policies affected the economy. However, Professor Schlesinger was by no means unusual among intellectuals for reaching sweeping conclusions about economic issues without feeling any need to understand economics. Chapter 4. Intellectuals and Social Visions. At the core of every moral code, there is a picture of human nature, a map of the universe, and a version of history. To human nature of the sort conceived, in a universe of the kind imagined, after a history so understood, the rules of the code apply. Walter Lippmann. Intellectuals do not simply have a series of isolated opinions on a variety of subjects. Behind those opinions is usually some coherent, overarching conception of the world, a social vision. Intellectuals are like other people in having visions, some intuitive sense of how the world works, what causes what. The vision around which most contemporary intellectuals tend to coalesce has features that distinguish it from other visions prevalent in other segments of contemporary society or among elites or masses in earlier times. While visions differ, a vision of some kind or other underlies attempts to explain either physical or social phenomena, whether by intellectuals or by others. Some visions are more sweeping and dramatic than others, as well as differing in the particular assumptions on which they are based, but all kinds of thinking, whether formal or informal, must start somewhere, with a hunch, a suspicion, or an intuition of some sort, in short, with a vision of causal connections. Systematically working out the implications of that vision can produce a theory, which in turn can be refined into specific hypotheses that can be tested against empirical evidence. But the preconceived idea, supposedly unscientific, must nearly always be there, as British historian Paul Johnson put it. Economist J. A. Schumpeter defined a vision as a pre-analytic cognitive act. What then is the prevailing vision of the intelligentsia, including both the solid core of intellectuals and the surrounding penumbra of those who follow their lead? And what alternative vision opposes them? A conflict of visions. At the heart of the social vision prevalent among contemporary intellectuals is the belief that there are problems created by existing institutions and that solutions to these problems can be excogitated by intellectuals. This vision is both a vision of society and a vision of the role of intellectuals within society. In short, intellectuals have seen themselves not simply as an elite, in the passive sense, in which large landowners, rentiers, or holders of various sinecures might qualify as elites, but as an anointed elite, people with a mission to lead others in one way or another to better lives. John Stuart Mill, who epitomized the intellectual in many ways, expressed this view explicitly when he said that the present wretched education and wretched social arrangements were the only real hindrance to attaining general happiness among human beings. Moreover, Mill saw the intelligentsia, the most cultivated intellects in the country, the thinking minds, the best and wisest, as guides to a better world, in their role of those who have been in advance of society in thought and feeling. This has been the role of the intelligentsia, as seen by the intelligentsia, both before and after Mill's time, that of intellectual leaders whose deeper insights can liberate people from the needless restrictions of society. Jean-Jacques Rousseau's famous declaration, "Man was born free, and he is everywhere in chains," summarizes the heart of the vision of the anointed, that social contrivances are the root cause of human unhappiness, and explain the fact that the world we see around us differs so greatly from the world that we would like to see. In this vision, oppression, poverty, injustice, and war are all products of existing institutions, problems whose solutions require changing those institutions, which in turn require changing the ideas behind those institutions. In short, the ills of society are seen as ultimately an intellectual and moral problem, for which intellectuals are especially equipped to provide answers, by virtue of their greater knowledge and insight, as well as their not having vested economic interests to bias them in favor of the existing order and still the voice of conscience. Large, unmerited differences in the economic and social prospects of people born into different social circumstances have long been a central theme of intellectuals with the vision of the anointed. Contrasts between the grinding poverty of some and the luxurious extravagance of others, compounded by similar unmerited contrasts in social status, are among the problems that have long dominated the agenda of those with the vision of the anointed. More general sources of unhappiness among people across the social spectrum, the psychic problems created by moral stigma, as well as the horrors of war, for example, are also things for which intellectual solutions are sought. This vision of society, in which there are many problems to be solved by applying the ideas of morally anointed intellectual elites, is by no means the only vision, however much that vision may be prevalent among today's intellectuals. A conflicting vision has coexisted for centuries, a vision in which the inherent flaws of human beings are the fundamental problem, and social contrivances are simply imperfect means of trying to cope with that problem, these imperfections themselves being products of the inherent shortcomings of human beings. A classical scholar has contrasted modern visions of the anointed with the darker picture painted by Thucydides of a human race that escaped chaos and barbarism by preserving with difficulty a thin layer of civilization based on moderation and prudence, growing out of experience. This is a tragic vision of the human condition that is very different from the vision of the anointed. Solutions are not expected by those who see many of the frustrations, ills, and anomalies of life, the tragedy of the human condition, as being due to constraints inherent in human beings, singly and collectively, and in the physical world in which they live. In contrast to the vision of today's anointed, where existing society is discussed largely in terms of its inadequacies and the improvements which the anointed have to offer, the tragic vision regards civilization itself as something that requires great and constant efforts merely to be preserved, with these efforts to be based on actual experience, not on exciting new theories. In the tragic vision, barbarism is always waiting in the wings, and civilization is simply a thin crust over a volcano. This vision has few solutions to offer, and many painful trade-offs to ponder. Commenting on Felix Frankfurter's references to the success of various reforms, Oliver Wendell Holmes wanted to know what the costs, the trade-offs, were. Otherwise, while lifting up society in one respect, "How the devil can I tell whether I am not pulling it down more in some other place?" he asked. This constrained vision is thus a tragic vision, not in the sense of believing that life must always be sad and gloomy, for much happiness and fulfillment are possible within a constrained world, but tragic in limitations that cannot be overcome merely by compassion, commitment, or other virtues which those with the vision of the anointed advocate or attribute to themselves. In the tragic vision, social contrivances seek to restrict behavior that leads to unhappiness, even though these restrictions themselves cause a certain amount of unhappiness. It is a vision of trade-offs rather than solutions, and a vision of wisdom distilled from the experiences of the many, rather than the brilliance of a few. The conflict between these two visions goes back for centuries. Those with the tragic vision and those with the vision of the anointed do not simply happen to differ on a range of policy issues. They necessarily differ, because they are talking about very different worlds which exist inside their minds. Moreover, they are talking about different creatures who inhabit that world, even though both call these creatures human beings, for the nature of those human beings is also fundamentally different, as seen in the two visions. In the constrained vision, there are especially severe limits on how much any given individual can know and truly understand, which is why this vision puts such emphasis on systemic processes whose economic and social transactions draw upon the knowledge and experience of millions, past and present. In the vision of the anointed, however, far more knowledge and intelligence are available to some people, and the difference between them and the masses is far greater than in the constrained vision. These opposing visions differ not only in what they believe exists and in what they think is possible, but also in what they think needs explaining. To those with the vision of the anointed, it is such evils as poverty, crime, war, and injustice which require explanation. To those with the tragic vision, it is prosperity, law, peace, and such justice as we have achieved, which require not only explanation but constant efforts, trade-offs, and sacrifices just to maintain them at their existing levels, much less promote their enhancement over time. While those with the vision of the anointed seek the causes of war, for example, those with the tragic vision say such things as, "No peace keeps itself," that peace is an unstable equilibrium which can be preserved only by acknowledged supremacy or equal power, that a nation despicable by its weakness forfeits even the privilege of being neutral, and that nations in general will make war whenever they have a prospect of getting anything by it. A tragic vision is a sort of zero-based vision of the world and of human beings, taking none of the benefits of civilization for granted. It does not assume that we can begin with what we already have and simply tack on improvements, without being concerned at every step with whether these innovations jeopardize the very processes and principles on which our existing level of well-being rests. It does not assume that the chafing restrictions conveyed to us by social contrivances, from prices to stigmas, are caused by those contrivances. Above all, it does not assume that untried theories stand on the same footing as institutions and practices whose very existence demonstrate their ability to survive in the world of reality, however much that reality falls short of what can be imagined as a better world. As Professor Richard A. Epstein of the University of Chicago put it, "The study of human institutions is always a search for the most tolerable imperfections." The two visions differ fundamentally, not only in how they see the world, but also in how those who believe in these visions see themselves. If you happen to believe in free markets, judicial restraint, traditional values, and other features of the tragic vision, then you are just someone who believes in free markets, judicial restraint, and traditional values. There is no personal exaltation resulting from those beliefs. But to be for social justice and saving the environment, or to be anti-war, is more than just a set of beliefs about empirical facts. This vision puts you on a higher moral plane, as someone concerned and compassionate, someone who is for peace in the world, a defender of the downtrodden, and someone who wants to preserve the beauty of nature and save the planet from being polluted by others less caring. In short, one vision makes you somebody special, and the other vision does not. These visions are not symmetrical. While the conflicts between the tragic vision and the vision of the anointed can lead to innumerable arguments on a wide range of issues, these can also lead to presentations of views that take the outward form of an argument without the inner substance of facts or analysis. In other words, arguments without arguments. Arguments without arguments. Although many intellectuals are especially well equipped by talent and training to engage in logically structured arguments using empirical evidence to analyze contending ideas, many of their political or ideological views are promoted by verbal virtuosity in evading structured arguments and empirical evidence. Among the many arguments without arguments are claims that opposing views are simplistic and opposing individuals unworthy, as well as assertions of rights and attributing to adversaries a belief in panaceas or golden ages. Simplistic arguments. Related to the assumption of the unworthiness of opponents is the assumption that certain arguments are unworthy because they are simplistic, not as a conclusion from counter-evidence or counter-arguments, but in lieu of counter-evidence or counter-arguments. It is a very effective debating tactic, however questionable it may be logically. With one word, it preempts the intellectual high ground without offering anything substantive. It is insinuated, rather than demonstrated, that a more complex explanation is more logically consistent or more empirically valid. That one argument may be simpler than another says nothing about which argument reaches conclusions that turn out to be validated by empirical evidence more often. Certainly the explanation of many physical phenomena, the sun setting over the horizon, for example, by the argument that the earth is round, is simpler than the more complex explanations of the same phenomena by members of the Flat Earth Society. Evasions of the obvious can become very complex. Before an explanation can be too simple, it must first be wrong. But often the fact that some explanation seems too simple becomes a substitute for showing that it is wrong. For example, when Professor Orley Ashenfelter, an economist at Princeton University, began to predict the prices of particular vintages of wine based solely on weather statistics during the growing season, without bothering to taste the wines or to consult experts who had tasted the wines, his method was dismissed as simplistic by wine connoisseurs, one of whom referred to the self-evident silliness of this method. However, Professor Ashenfelter's predictions have turned out to be substantiated more often than those of wine experts. Only after a given method has turned out to be wrong is it legitimate to call it simplistic. Otherwise, its use of smaller amounts of information to produce validated conclusions is greater efficiency. But use of the term simplistic has become a widely used argument without an argument, a way of dismissing opposing views without confronting them with either evidence or analysis. Virtually any answer to virtually any question can be made to seem simplistic by expanding the question to unanswerable dimensions, and then deriding the now inadequate answer as simplistic. For example, in the 1840s, an Austrian doctor collected statistics showing a substantial difference in mortality rates among women in maternity clinics in Vienna when they were examined by doctors who had washed their hands before examining them and doctors who had not. He sought to get all doctors to wash their hands before examining patients, but his suggestion was rejected, essentially as being simplistic, using a kind of argument that is still with us today. He was challenged to explain why washing one's hands would affect maternal mortality, and since this was before the germ theory of diseases was developed and accepted, he could not do so. In short, the question was expanded to the point where it could not be answered, at the current state of knowledge, thereby making any answer seem simplistic. However, the real issue was not whether the statistically minded doctor could explain the larger question, but whether his evidence on the more modest and mundane question was valid, and could therefore save lives based on empirical facts alone. The danger of committing the post hoc fallacy could have been easily avoided by continuing to collect data on whether more washing of hands by more doctors reduced current maternal mortality rates. Today, those who reject stronger police action and more severe punishment as ways of dealing with crime, and who prefer social programs and rehabilitation efforts, often stigmatize the traditional law and order approach by expanding the question to that of finding the root causes of crime, a question that police action and punishment cannot answer. Neither may alternative theories provide an answer that is convincing to those who require something more than an answer whose only basis is consonance with the prevailing vision. But the substitution of a much larger and more sweeping question for the more pragmatic and empirical question of which alternative approach to crime control has a better track record accomplishes the tactical purpose of derailing an alternative to the prevailing vision by making the alternative seem simplistic. Ironically, many of those who emphasize the complexities of real-world problems and issues nevertheless often also regard people with opposing views of those problems and issues as either intellectually or morally unworthy. In other words, despite an emphasis on the complexities involved, These problems or issues are not regarded as being so complex that a different person could weigh the various probabilities or values differently and legitimately arrive at a different conclusion. A variation on the theme of opponents' simplistic arguments is to say that whatever they advocate is no panacea, as indeed nothing is a panacea, or else by definition all the problems of the world would already have been solved. When the collapse of the communist bloc in Eastern Europe left Czechoslovakia celebrating its freedom, New York Times columnist Tom Wicker cautioned that freedom is not a panacea, and that communism has failed does not make the Western alternative perfect, or even satisfying for millions of those who live under it. That millions more people fled from the communist bloc to the West than went in the other direction might suggest where there was more satisfaction. But of course nothing human has ever achieved perfection, so the fact that intellectuals can always imagine something better than the best, that exists in reality, is hardly surprising. Clearly, however, Tom Wicker's vision is not the same as the vision of Richard Epstein, for whom the most we can hope for is a search for the most tolerable imperfections. A related assertion is that there was never a golden age, often said in answer to people who never claimed that there was, but who happened to think that some past practice produced better results than some present practice. Instead of offering evidence that the present practice produces